There is a moment, 1,100 meters beneath the surface of the sea, where the last photon of sunlight finally dies. Not dims, not fades, dies. You can watch it happen. If you ever find yourself sealed inside a sphere of titanium and glass, sinking. For a while there is still a memory of color above you, a deep, bruised blue, the kind of blue that has forgotten what the sky looks like. And then, somewhere in that descent, the blue gives up. The water outside the window turns to something that isn't a color at all. It is the absence of one. It is a black so total, so unbroken, that your own eyes begin to invent shapes inside it, just to have something to hold on to. And here is the part that no one tells you before you go down. That darkness is not empty. Something is down there with you. Something is always down there. And it has been there, in that lightless water, for longer than there have been eyes on Earth to be afraid of the dark. We have a habit, as a species, of believing we know our own planet. We name it, we map it, we draw its coastlines in confident ink and we hang it on classroom walls, and we tell our children, this is the world, this is home. And it is a beautiful lie. Because more than 95% of the space where life can exist on this planet is underwater, and the overwhelming majority of that water lies below the depth where light can reach. We have walked on the moon. We have sent machines past the edge of the solar system. We have photographed the surface of Mars in such detail that you could pick out a boulder the size of a car. And yet the floor of our own ocean, the actual physical bottom of the place we live, remains, for the most part, a blank. Think about that. Really sit inside it for a moment. There is more of this planet that no human eye has ever seen than there is land beneath your feet. There are mountain ranges down there longer than any on the continents. There are canyons that would swallow the Grand Canyon whole and leave no trace. There are plains of mud the size of countries where, in the time it takes you to read this sentence, a single particle of dust will have drifted a fraction of a millimeter closer to a bottom it may take 100 years to reach. And in all that darkness, things are alive. We have heard them. That's the part that keeps the scientists awake. In 1997, instruments designed to listen for submarines picked up a sound rising from the deep South Pacific. It was enormous, loud enough to be detected by sensors more than 5,000 kilometers apart. The shape of it, the rise and fall of it, looked almost organic, almost like something calling. For years it had no explanation. We have an entire catalog of sounds like this. Groans and pulses and slow, mournful tones drifting up from places no light has ever touched, recorded by machines, played back in quiet rooms by people who don't quite know how to feel about what they're hearing. Some of those sounds we have since explained. Some we have not, and that is the truth we keep circling back to. The truth this entire journey is built on. We are a species that lives on the thin-lit skin of a world whose vast, dark interior we have barely begun to understand. We have built a civilization on the assumption that we are the dominant life on Earth, and we may simply be the life that happens to live where the sun can find us. So tonight, we're going down. Not in metaphor, not in summary. We are going to descend, slowly, through every layer of the deep, from the bright and familiar surface all the way to the crushing black floor of the deepest trench on Earth, a place where the pressure could fold a steel submarine like paper, where the temperature hovers a single degree above freezing, where the weight of the entire ocean presses down with a force 8 tons against every square inch. And at each layer, we are going to meet what lives there. Some of it is beautiful. Some of it will frighten you in a way you didn't expect to be frightened. And some of it, I'll be honest with you now, so you're ready, some of it is going to change the way you understand life itself. Because the deeper we go, the more the rules begin to break. The things that should be impossible start happening. And by the time we reach the very bottom, the question we started with, what lives in the deepest parts of the ocean, is going to have quietly transformed into a much stranger, much older question. A question about what life even is, and whether the sunlit world we call home was ever really the main story at all. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Every descent begins the same way. It begins at the surface, in the light, where everything still seems to make sense. So let's start there. From the deck of a ship, the ocean lies to you. It does it so gently you'd never accuse it. On a calm morning, the sea is a sheet of beaten silver, rolling out flat to a horizon so clean you could draw a line along it. It looks finite. It looks like a surface, a lid, a skin, a thing with a top and presumably, somewhere, a bottom not too far below. People have stood on the decks of ships for thousands of years and looked at that surface and felt, in some quiet animal way, that they understood it, that it was knowable, a road of water between one piece of land and another. But the surface is not the ocean. The surface is the smallest, thinnest part of it. The surface is the part that gets to keep the sun. To understand the scale of what lies beneath, you have to do something almost physically uncomfortable. You have to stop thinking of the ocean as a thing you look across, and start thinking of it as a thing you fall into. Because the average depth of the sea is not a few dozen meters. It is nearly 4 kilometers. 4 kilometers of water, straight down, almost everywhere. If you could somehow lift the continents and drop the highest mountains on Earth into the average depth of the ocean, most of them would vanish completely, their peaks still leaving more than a kilometer of dark water overhead. And that's the average. That's the easy part. We tend to imagine the deep as a single place. The bottom, somewhere far down, vague and uniform. But the descent is not a fall into a single room. It is a journey through a series of utterly different worlds, stacked one on top of another, each one stranger and older and more alien than the one above it. The light changes. The pressure changes. The temperature changes. The food changes and grows scarce, and then almost disappears. And the creatures change to match, not gradually, but in great jolting transformations, as if at every threshold the ocean is asking the same brutal question, and the life there is forced to find a new answer. The question is always, how do you survive here? The answers are what we've come to see. In the very top layer, the part that gets the light, the part we know best, the part that feeds nearly everything below it, life is almost embarrassingly abundant. Sunlight pours down through the first few meters, and microscopic plants, the phytoplankton, drink it in and turn it into living matter, the same way grass and forests do on land. This is the engine. This is where the energy of the sun is captured and made edible, and almost every living thing in the entire ocean, from the tiniest shrimp to creatures we'll meet at the very bottom of the world, is ultimately living off this thin, sunlit harvest at the top. Remember that. Hold on to it. Almost everything that lives in the deep is, in some sense, eating sunlight that fell into the water far above and slowly drifted down. The deep ocean is fed by the death of the world above it. We'll come back to that. We'll come back to it more than once, and each time it will mean something a little darker. But here, near the surface, none of that is visible yet. Here it is bright and warm and busy. And here is where the first humans who ever tried to go deeper learned, very quickly, that the ocean does not want us inside it. Because the moment you leave the surface, the moment you actually try to descend, the lie of the calm sea reveals its teeth. The first thing that comes for you is the pressure. At the surface, you live under the weight of the entire atmosphere, every kilometer of air stacked above your head, and you don't even feel it. Because you've never known anything else. But water is roughly 800 times denser than air. Go down just 10 meters into the sea, and you've doubled the pressure on your body. Go down another 10, and you've added the weight of a whole second atmosphere again. The deeper you go, the faster the weight piles on, and it does not stop, and it does not care, and it has no mercy for the soft, air-filled, surface-built creature that we are. The early divers learned this in the most terrible ways. They went down holding their breath, hunting pearls and sponges, and their lungs were squeezed smaller and smaller by the rising pressure. They learned that the human body could descend further than it should ever have been able to, and that it paid for every meter. When they came back up too fast, the gases that had dissolved into their blood under pressure came frothing out of solution like the bubbles in a bottle of soda suddenly opened, and the bubbles tore at their joints and their nerves and sometimes their brains. They called it the bends, and they did not understand it, and they died of it, and still they went down. There was something on the bottom worth having. There always is. And these were the shallows. These deaths, these agonies, this whole grim education in the violence of pressure, all of it happened in the first 30 or 40 meters, in the part of the ocean that still has light, in the part that, on the scale of the true deep, doesn't even count. We have not yet left the brightly lit attic of the sea, and already it has killed people just for trying to look down the stairs. So imagine, and we are going to spend the next 3 hours imagining, descending, layer by layer. Imagine what waits below. The light is already starting to go. Not all of it. Not yet. But as we sink past 40 meters, past 50, the red has already vanished from the world. Water swallows red light first. It absorbs it within the first few meters, which is why everything down here is rendered in blue and green, why a diver's bleeding wound runs an eerie, lifeless black instead of red. Then the orange goes. Then the yellow. The world is being quietly stripped of its colors from the warm end of the spectrum inward, and almost nobody at the surface ever notices, because almost nobody ever goes deep enough to watch it happen. By 200 meters, the harvest of sunlight is essentially over. There is not enough light left to feed the tiny plants. The phytoplankton thin out and stop, and we cross a line, invisible, unmarked, but as real as any border on Earth. We are leaving the world that feeds itself. Everything below this point lives off scraps. They call the next layer the twilight zone. It runs from about 200 meters down to 1,000, and the name is exactly right, because what you find here is a perpetual, deepening dusk, the long, blue, dying afterglow of a sun that can no longer quite reach. There is light here, but barely. It is enough to see by if you are built for it, and almost nothing here is built the way you'd expect. It is not enough to grow anything. It is not enough to warm anything. It is just enough to cast the faintest suggestion of up, a slightly less blackness overhead, and that single thread of orientation turns out to be one of the most important facts in the entire ocean, because in this dim blue middle world, between the lit surface and the eternal night below, something happens every single day that is, by sheer mass, the largest movement of living creatures anywhere on the planet. Every night, as the sun sets on the world above, the twilight zone rises. Billions upon billions of small animals, little lanternfish with rows of glowing dots along their bellies, shrimp and squid, and strange transparent things shaped like nothing you have a word for, all of them lift up out of the deep in a vast, synchronized migration toward the surface. They have spent the daylight hours hiding down in the dark, where the dim light makes them hard to see, where the predators that hunt by sight cannot easily find them. And now, under cover of night, they climb toward the richer feeding grounds near the top, to eat, to grow, to live a little, and then, before the dawn can catch them out in the open, they sink back down again into the protective gloom, up at dusk, down at dawn. Every day. Across the entire global ocean. A wall of life the size of the planet, breathing in and out with the turning of the Earth. It is so vast that we discovered it by accident, and at first we were terrified of it. During the Second World War, sonar operators aboard ships and submarines began noticing something that made no sense. Their instruments, pinging down into the deep to map the seafloor and find enemy vessels, kept returning a false bottom. A solid layer that registered at a few hundred meters down, far shallower than the actual floor. And here was the maddening part. The phantom seafloor moved. It rose toward the surface at night. It sank back down at dawn. It was as if the bottom of the ocean were breathing, climbing up to meet them in the dark and retreating from them in the light. It took years to understand what they were really seeing. The false bottom was not the bottom at all. It was life. Countless small creatures, so densely packed across so vast an area that their tiny gas-filled bodies bounced the sonar back as if they were solid ground. The operators had stumbled onto the deep scattering layer, the Great Daily Migration, and they had been listening, without knowing it, to the heartbeat of the living sea. I find something almost unbearably moving in that. We sent our machines down into the dark to hunt for our own kind, to make war on each other across the surface of the world, and what answered, what rose to meet us in the blackness, was the largest gathering of life on the planet, doing the same thing it had been doing for tens of millions of years before we ever thought to listen. We were looking for enemies. We found a migration older than our species, and we mistook it for the floor of the world. This is the first lesson of the deep, and it will repeat in different forms all the way down. The thing you assume is solid ground is alive. The thing you assume is empty is full. You are not the most important thing in the dark. And here is something about that great migration that almost no one knows, something that connects those billions of small rising creatures directly to you, to the air you are breathing right now. When the animals of the twilight zone climb to the surface at night to feed, and then sink back down into the dark before dawn, they are not only hiding, they are carrying. Every night they feed near the top, and every day they descend deep, and down there in the dark they breathe, and they release their waste, and eventually they die, and in doing so, they take carbon that was captured at the surface and they drag it down into the deep, locking it away from the atmosphere, day after day, in numbers so vast that this single daily migration is one of the most important processes regulating the climate of the entire planet. The creatures we mistook for the floor of the world are, it turns out, helping to hold the world's thermostat steady, quietly, invisibly, every single night, with no idea that they are doing it. Which means something strange and humbling. The stability of the climate you live in, the seasons your crops depend on, the weather your whole civilization is built around, rests partly on the nightly labor of countless small glowing creatures you have never seen, doing in the dark a job they do not know they are doing, in a place you will never go. We did not even understand this until recently. We are still working out the full scale of it. And we have already begun, without meaning to disturb it, because there are fishing fleets now turning their attention to the twilight zone, eyeing those enormous swarms of small fish as the last great untapped harvest of the sea. A protein supply of staggering size, just waiting in the dark. To strip mine that migration for fish meal, before we even understand the job it is silently doing for the climate, may be one of the more quietly consequential decisions our species ever makes. And almost no one is talking about it. Almost no one even knows the migration is there. Down here, in the twilight, the creatures begin to look strange, but they look strange in ways that still make a kind of sense to us, because they're solving problems we can almost imagine. The hatchetfish, for instance, is a small, flattened silver creature that looks like it was stamped out of foil, and along its underside, it carries rows of light-producing organs. It uses them to perform one of the most elegant tricks in the ocean, counter-illumination. Down here, the only reliable danger comes from below, from predators looking up, hunting for the dark shape of prey silhouetted against the faint glow of the surface far overhead. So the hatchetfish glows on its belly, precisely matching the dim light filtering down from above, erasing its own shadow, becoming invisible by producing the exact amount of light needed to disappear. Read that again. There are creatures in the twilight zone that survive by carefully, constantly calculating how much light is falling on them from above, and then generating exactly that much light from their own bodies, so that to anything looking up, they simply aren't there. They have turned themselves into windows. They erase their existence with light, in a place where light is almost gone. And this is the shallow end of the strange. This is the part of the deep that's still close enough to the sun to play these subtle games with brightness. We have not even reached the true darkness yet, but we're approaching it. As we sink past the lanternfish and the hatchetfish, past 500 meters, past 700, the last blue thread of the surface grows thinner and thinner. The migrating swarms are below us now in the day, above us at night, and soon they too will thin out. Because even this dim twilight is about to fail completely. Below 1,000 meters, the sun is finished. Not faded, not dim. Gone. And the thing about that boundary, the thing that I want you to feel as we cross it, is that it is not rare. We tend to think of total darkness as an extreme, an exception, a special horror reserved for caves and nightmares. But the layer we are about to enter, the eternal night below 1,000 meters, is the single largest living space on planet Earth. It is bigger than every forest, every desert, every grassland and tundra and jungle combined. It is bigger than all the sunlit ocean above it. The default condition of life on this planet, the most common environment a living thing can find itself in, is not the green field or the blue sky. It is the dark. And we are about to find out what learned to live there. Welcome to the Midnight Zone. This is where the dark begins, in earnest. And it does not end. From 1,000 meters down to 4,000, this layer of water stands 4 times taller than it is wide across most of the planet, and in every drop of it, in every direction, there is no sun. There never was. There never will be. A creature can be born here, live its entire life here, and die here without once meeting a single beam of sunlight. To us, light is the ordinary thing, and darkness is the exception we light candles against. Down here it is precisely reversed. Down here, darkness is the world. Light is the rarest, most precious, most dangerous thing there is. And so the creatures of the Midnight Zone learn to make it themselves. This is the part of the journey where I have to ask you to set down almost everything you think you know about how animals look and behave. Because the rules that shaped life up in the sun simply don't reach this far. Up there, light is free and constant and falls on everything. Down here, every spark a creature produces costs energy, energy that is almost impossible to come by, in a place where a meal is a rumor that drifts down from a world they will never see. And yet, against all of that, the overwhelming majority of animals in the deep ocean make their own light. The numbers are hard to believe. In some layers of the deep, as many as 9 out of every 10 creatures glow. Sit with what that means. Picture what you would see if your eyes could only adjust. Not blackness. A slow, drifting galaxy of living light, blue and green sparks igniting and dying, strings of glowing beads, sudden silent flares, soft pulses fading into the black. An entire city signaling to itself in a language made of light, in a place where, by every assumption we carry down from the surface, light should be impossible. But why blue? Why almost always blue and green? There's a reason, and it's the kind of reason that makes the whole deep feel less like an accident and more like a design no one drew. Blue light travels furthest through seawater. The warm colors, the reds and oranges, are swallowed within meters. So over millions of years, the life of the deep converged on the one color that carries, and not only the light they make, but the eyes they see with. Almost everything down here is tuned to blue. Their light is blue. Their vision is blue. It is a closed conversation, an entire civilization speaking a single color into the dark. which raises a quiet, unsettling question. If everyone speaks blue, if every creature both glows blue and sees only blue, then what would happen to the creature that learned to break the rule? Hold that thought. We're going to meet it in a moment, and when we do, I think it will frighten you a little. But first, the most famous resident of the eternal night, the one you're probably already picturing. The anglerfish. You know the shape, even if you've never seen the real thing. The gaping mouth, the needle teeth, the lure dangling from the forehead like a fishing rod tipped with a single glowing pearl. That glow is real, and it's not the fish's own light, it's bacteria, living symbiotically inside the lure, fed and housed by the fish in exchange for the one thing that matters down here, a point of light in the dark. And anything in the deep that is drawn to a point of light, anything curious, anything hungry, anything hoping that glow means food, swims toward it and finds the teeth waiting in the black just behind the lamp. That alone would be horror enough. A fish that goes fishing with a living lantern in a place where light means either dinner or death. But the anglerfish is hiding something far stranger than its hunting, and to understand it, you have to understand the deepest problem of the midnight zone. Not finding food, finding each other. Think about the scale of this place. 4,000 meters of black water, spread across the entire planet, almost empty. The creatures here are scattered so thinly across so vast a darkness that the odds of one anglerfish ever, in its whole life, drifting close enough to another to reproduce are almost nothing. It is the loneliest math in the world. You are born into an endless dark, you will likely never encounter another of your kind, and if you do, it will be the only chance you ever get. So evolution did something here that I still find difficult to talk about without lowering my voice. The anglerfish you're picturing, the big one, with the lure and the teeth, is always female. The males are a different creature entirely. Tiny, sometimes smaller than your fingernail. Built with almost nothing but enormous nostrils and enormous eyes, because the male anglerfish is born for a single purpose and given almost no body with which to achieve it, to find a female in all that endless black, before he starves. He cannot really feed himself. He is a searcher, a scrap of life with a nose and a deadline, swimming through the dark, following the faintest trace of her scent or the distant glow of her lure. And if he finds her, if, against everything, he finds her, he bites. He clamps onto her body, and he does not let go. And then something happens that has no real parallel anywhere else in the animal world. His mouth begins to fuse with her skin. Their tissues merge. Their blood vessels join together until they share a single circulatory system, until he is no longer feeding himself at all, but drawing everything he needs directly from her body. His eyes degenerate, his fins wither, his organs dissolve, one by one, everything he no longer needs, until the male is reduced to little more than a pair of reproductive organs hanging permanently from the female's flank, a source of sperm, available to her whenever she needs it for the rest of her life. Some females carry several of these fused males at once, the absorbed remnants of every desperate suitor that ever found her in the dark. I don't tell you that to disturb you. I tell you because of what it means. In a place this empty, this lonely, this hostile to the simple act of two creatures meeting, life did not give up. It found a way to make a single meeting last forever. The male anglerfish gives up his eyes, his body, his independent existence, his self, for the only chance at connection he will ever have. He becomes part of her. He dissolves into the only other living thing he ever found in all that dark. There is something almost unbearably tender buried inside something almost unbearably grotesque, and the midnight zone is full of exactly that contradiction. Beauty and horror, refusing to separate. We're going to keep running into it, all the way down. And now, the rule breaker. The creature I asked you to hold in your mind. Remember the closed conversation, the entire deep speaking a single color, blue light into blue eyes. There is a fish down here called the dragonfish, and it learned to cheat. The dragonfish is small, eel-bodied, armed with fangs so long it cannot fully close its mouth over them, and like so many predators of the deep, it carries light-producing organs. But beneath its eyes, the dragonfish carries a second kind of lamp, one that produces not blue light, but red. And here is why that single fact is one of the most chilling adaptations in the entire ocean. Down here, no one can see red. Red light dies in seawater so fast that nothing in the deep ever evolved eyes for it. To every other creature in the midnight zone, red light is simply invisible. It does not exist. Except the dragonfish can see it. Do you understand what that means? The dragonfish moves through the dark carrying its own private spotlight, a beam of red light that washes over its prey, illuminating shrimp and small fish in perfect detail, and the prey have no idea. They cannot perceive the light that is falling on them. They are lit up, exposed, hunted, and to their own eyes they are still safe in total darkness. The dragonfish sees in a color no one else even knows is there. It hunts with a flashlight that only it can see. It is a predator that has stepped, quietly, outside the rules of the entire world it lives in, and everything around it is dying without ever understanding how. That is the Midnight Zone, a place where survival has been pushed so far past our intuitions that creatures wage invisible wars in colors that, for everyone else, do not exist. And think about what the dragonfish's secret red light really tells us. It tells us that down here, in the dark, there has been an arms race, a silent, escalating, million-year war fought entirely in light and the perception of light. Because for every creature that learned to make light, something else learned to see it. And for every creature that learned to hide its light, something learned to find it anyway. The hatchetfish erases its silhouette with counter-illumination, and so predators evolved more sensitive eyes and special filters, trying to catch the faint mismatch between the fish's glow and the true light of the surface. Prey evolved to glow more precisely. Predators evolved to see more keenly. On and on, in the dark. For ages, a contest of light against light. Sight against sight. Each side forcing the other to grow stranger. And the dragonfish's red light is what happens when one side, just once, manages to step entirely off the board, to invent a move the other side has no defense against, because the other side cannot even perceive that the move exists. It is the deep-sea equivalent of a weapon no one else can detect. And the chilling thought, the one the biologists themselves raise, is this. If one creature down there found a way to see in a color no one else can perceive, how many other secret channels are there? How many invisible wars are being fought in the dark, in senses and signals and colors we have not even thought to look for, between creatures we have barely met? The dragonfish is the one cheat we happen to catch. The dark may be full of cheats we have not. We are, after all, looking into that world with eyes built for the surface, and we may be missing most of what is actually happening, simply because it is happening in registers we were never built to sense. And the deeper truth, the one that keeps surfacing, is that every one of these adaptations, the lure, the fused males, the secret red light, every one of them is an answer to the same brutal scarcity. There is almost no food here. Almost none. Everything alive in the Midnight Zone is living off the thin, slow rain of dead matter falling from the sunlit world far above. The bodies of creatures that died nearer the surface, the waste, the fragments, drifting down through kilometers of black water, most of it eaten or dissolved long before it ever arrives. By the time that food reaches the Midnight Zone, only a whisper of it is left. So the bodies here are built around hunger. The gulper eel is mostly mouth, a vast, hinged balloon of a jaw attached to a thin whip of a tail, because when a meal is so rare, you cannot afford to let any size of prey escape. You must be able to swallow something larger than yourself, on the slim chance you ever find it. Other fish here have stomachs that stretch grotesquely, hearts that beat slow, metabolisms idled down almost to stillness. They hang motionless in the water for hours, for days, conserving everything, waiting. Many of them will eat only a handful of times in a year. Some will go months between meals and feel no urgency about it, because urgency burns energy, and energy is the one thing they cannot replace. Imagine a life like that, suspended in absolute darkness, almost weightless, almost motionless, the cold pressing in on every side, waiting in a silence so complete that the arrival of a single sinking carcass is the great event of a season. No sky, no warmth, no company but the occasional drifting spark of another creature's light, glimpsed and gone. We would call it a nightmare. We would call it isolation beyond endurance. For the majority of the animals on this planet, it is simply home. It is, statistically, the most normal way to be alive. And there is one creature here I cannot leave the midnight zone without showing you, because it embodies, more than any other, the way the deep takes our fears and turns them into something stranger and gentler than we expect. It has a name that sounds like the title of a nightmare. The vampire squid. Vampiroteuthis infernalis, the vampire squid from hell, the scientists actually named it, in a moment of either humor or genuine unease. It is small, dark red, with skin like velvet and eyes that, relative to its body, are among the largest of any animal on Earth. Webbing connects its arms like a dark cloak, and the inside of that cloak is lined with rows of spines. When it is threatened, it can turn itself inside out, pulling that spined cloak up over its own body, becoming a bristling dark sphere. A defensive posture so eerie it looks like something dreamed up to frighten children. And what does this creature from hell, this vampire of the deep, actually eat? Nothing it has to kill. Nothing it has to hunt. The vampire squid drifts in the oxygen-poor depths of the midnight zone, in water so low in oxygen that almost nothing else can survive there, which is precisely why it lives there, safe from predators that cannot follow, and it trails two long, thin filaments out into the dark. And it waits. And the marine snow drifts down, the falling death of the world above, and it settles on those filaments, and the vampire squid gathers it in and binds it with mucus and eats the dust of the dead. That is all. The most fearsome-sounding creature in the deep is a quiet, patient gatherer of falling debris, living alone in water no one else wants, harming nothing, asking nothing, drifting in the dark on the slow rain of a world it will never see. We gave it the name of a monster. It is one of the gentlest things down here. The deep does this again and again. It takes the shapes our nightmares are made of, the teeth, the dark, the cloaks and spines and enormous eyes, and reveals, underneath them, lives that are not monstrous at all, only adapted, only surviving, only doing, in the dark, the patient work of staying alive. The horror we feel looking at these creatures is our horror, not theirs. We are the ones who brought the fear down with us. They were never frightening. They were only home. And the people who go down to study them, the marine biologists who have spent their lives sending cameras and submersibles into this dark, will tell you that the fear does not last. That the first time you see the deep, it terrifies you, the way it terrifies all of us, in that old animal place. And then, slowly, as you keep looking, the terror turns into something else. Into tenderness, into a strange protective love for these soft, strange, patient creatures, scraping out their lives in the most hostile place on the planet, asking nothing, harming no one, glowing quietly in a dark that will outlast us all. There are scientists who have given their entire lives to the deep, who have spent thousands of hours staring into that black water through small windows and screens, and who speak about it the way you might speak about a person you love, with awe, with worry, with a grief at how little time and money and attention the world is willing to give to the largest part of its own home. For the majority of the animals on this planet, the dark is simply home, and for a small handful of human beings, it has become a home of a different kind. A place they cannot stop returning to. A darkness they have learned to love. And we have not even reached the bottom. We are only at 4,000 meters. The midnight zone is ending now, its lower edge dissolving into something even older and even stranger, a place so vast and so still that the creatures of the deep night above would seem frantic by comparison. Below us now lies the abyss. And the abyss runs on death. 4,000 meters down, and the world goes quiet in a way that the layers above were not. The midnight zone, for all its darkness, was still a place of movement, of hunting, of migration overhead, of creatures drifting up and down between the night and the deeper night. But here, on the great abyssal plains that cover nearly half the surface of the entire planet, the motion drains away. This is the floor of the deep ocean as it exists almost everywhere, not jagged trenches, not dramatic canyons, but immense, flat, soft plains of fine sediment, stretching for thousands of kilometers in perfect, lightless monotony. If the midnight zone is an endless night, the abyssal plain is the morning after the end of everything. Silent, cold, still, and patient beyond any human sense of patience. The temperature here hovers between 1 and 4 degrees above freezing, and it does not change. Not in summer, not in winter, not in 1,000 years. The surface world burns and freezes and storms through its seasons, and down here, none of it arrives. The water at the bottom of the abyss is, in some places, water that last touched the surface and saw the sky 1,000 years ago, before sinking at the poles and creeping along the seafloor in currents so slow they are measured not in speed, but in centuries. You are, in a real sense, breathing the past down here. The abyss is where the ocean keeps its memory. And it is almost empty. Almost. Because nothing grows here, there is no light, so there are no plants, so there is no foundation of living energy the way there is on the surface. Every single calorie of life on the abyssal plane has to fall from above. And so the bottom of the world is fed by the only thing the surface reliably sends down. It is fed by death. They call it marine snow, and it is one of the strangest and most beautiful and most quietly sorrowful phenomena on Earth. Look up from the abyssal floor, and you would see it, drifting down through the black, a constant, gentle, never-ending fall of pale flakes, sinking slowly through the water like snow through a windless winter night. But it is not snow. It is the dead. It is the bodies of the tiny plankton that lived and died in the sunlight kilometers above, bound together with scraps of waste and fragments of larger creatures and the cast-off remains of the entire living ocean overhead. It clumps as it falls. It sinks for days, sometimes weeks, drifting down through every layer we have already passed, feeding the creatures of the twilight and the midnight on its way, so that by the time it reaches the abyss, it is the leftovers of leftovers, the last thin residue of a feast that happened in a world the abyss will never see. And on this faint falling rain of death, an entire world survives. The creatures of the abyssal plain are built for an economy of almost nothing. Sea cucumbers, soft, slow, blind things, crawl across the mud, swallowing the sediment itself to strain out the few specks of nourishment buried in it, plowing the bottom of the world like livestock grazing a pasture of dust. There are sea pigs, plump and pink and oddly endearing, gathering in slow herds wherever a richer scrap of food has settled. Brittle stars carpet some regions in their millions, arms tangled across the mud. Strange, stalked creatures stand fixed to the bottom, filtering the falling snow. Everything moves slowly. Everything wastes nothing. Everything waits. Because the abyss is a place of waiting, and every so often, the waiting is rewarded by something that, to the creatures of the deep, must feel like the end of a famine and the arrival of a god. Something enormous dies in the world above, and it begins to fall. Let me tell you what happens when a whale dies. A whale is the largest animal that has ever lived, larger than any dinosaur, a creature of such staggering size that the surface ocean can feed it only by offering up its krill and its small fish in unimaginable numbers. And when a great whale finally dies, somewhere up in the lit and living sea, its enormous body begins to sink. It falls through the twilight zone. It falls through the midnight zone, past the anglerfish and the dragonfish and the waiting, hungry mouths. And finally, after a fall of kilometers, it comes to rest on the abyssal plain, tons upon tons of flesh and bone arriving in a place that, on an ordinary day, survives on a whisper of falling dust. To the abyss, this is not a death. It is a creation. It is an event that the seafloor may not see again for years, and around it, almost at once, a world begins to assemble itself out of the dark. We call it a whale fall. And we did not even know it existed until the 1980s, when researchers exploring the deep with submersibles stumbled across the skeleton of a whale on the ocean floor and found it swarming with life that they could not at first explain. What they had found was an entire ecosystem born from a single death, unfolding over decades in stages, like a city rising and flourishing and decaying on the corpse of a giant. First come the scavengers. Hagfish, sleeper sharks, swarms of strange amphipods, they arrive within hours or days, summoned out of the empty dark by the scent of all that flesh, and they strip the body down, sometimes consuming most of the soft tissue within months. It is a frenzy in slow motion, a feast in a place that almost never feeds. Then, when the flesh is gone, a second wave arrives, creatures that colonize the remaining scraps and the enriched mud around the bones, worms and snails and crustaceans living in the wreckage left behind, sometimes for years. And then, last and strangest of all, when there is seemingly nothing left but the bare white skeleton lying in the dark, the bones themselves begin to come alive, because the bones are full of fat. A whale's skeleton is saturated with oils, locked away inside the bone, and there is a creature in the deep that learned to get at it. They are called osedacs, the bone-eating worms, and we discovered them only at the turn of this century, growing in soft red and pink tufts across the surface of whale skeletons, and they are unlike almost anything else alive. They have no mouth, they have no stomach, they have no gut at all. Instead, they grow root like tendrils that bore directly into the bone, dissolving it from within, and inside those roots they keep colonies of bacteria that break down the trapped fats and feed the worm from the inside out. They are, in a sense, less like an animal eating a meal, and more like a plant sending roots into soil. Except the soil is the skeleton of the largest creature that ever lived, and the field they are farming is its death. And here, of course, because this is the deep, and the deep cannot resist this particular cruelty, here the story turns lonely again. The visible osedax worms, the ones rooted into the bone, are all female. The males are microscopic. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of them, live. Their entire dwarf lives inside the body of a single female, never growing up, never leaving, existing only to fertilize her eggs, the same haunting bargain the anglerfish struck, written again, in a different creature, on the bones of a corpse at the bottom of the world. The deep keeps arriving at the same answer. When you are this scattered, this rare, this alone, you do not let a partner go. You keep them. You carry them. You make a single meeting last a lifetime. A whale fall can sustain life for 50 years, half a century of feeding, an entire ecosystem of dozens of species, some of which exist almost nowhere else on Earth, all of it born from one death and surviving on it for longer than many of us will be married. And then, when even the bones are finally consumed, when the last worm has dissolved the last scrap of oil, the city goes dark. The creatures release their young into the current, tiny drifting larvae cast out into kilometers of empty black water, searching the way the male anglerfish searched, for the almost impossible, another death, another fallen giant, somewhere out there in all that dark, before they themselves run out of time. Think about that journey. A larva, the size of a speck of dust, set adrift in the largest, emptiest space on the planet, carrying the only instructions it will ever have: find another fallen whale. Across distances it has no way to measure, with odds against it that we cannot even properly calculate. And yet whale falls all over the world are colonized, again and again, by exactly these creatures. Which means the impossible search succeeds. Somehow, constantly, in the dark, without eyes, without maps, without any sense we would recognize, the abyss runs on death, and on the willingness of life to cross unimaginable emptiness for the slimmest chance of more. There is something here that I have to say plainly, because it sits at the center of everything we are seeing. The deep ocean is a world built on the dead of the world above. Every creature on the abyssal plain, every scavenger, every worm rooted in a whale's bones, every soft pale thing crawling through the silt, all of them are alive because something else, somewhere far above, in the light, died and sank. We tend to think of death as an ending, a closing, a loss. And up in the bright world, in our brief frantic lives, it feels that way. But down here, death is not an ending. Death is the harvest. Death is the gift the surface sends to the dark. The whale that dies becomes, in its falling, a sun for the abyss, a single body that feeds a city of life for 50 years, that supports species that exist almost nowhere else, that turns its own ending into the foundation of more lives than it ever shared the sea with while it was alive. There is no waste in the deep. There is no loss that is not also a beginning. The dead of the upper world fall, and the dark catches them and turns them, patiently, into life again. And I find I cannot think about that without it pressing on something tender. Because there is a kind of comfort in it, and a kind of vertigo, both at once. Everything that lives in the sunlit world will, in the end, return to the sea. Every creature that dies near the water, every particle that washes down the rivers, every body that sinks, and the deep receives all of it, without judgment, without ceremony, and makes it into something living again. The abyss is the planet's quietest act of mercy. It does not let anything be wasted. It takes the endings of the world above and patiently, in the dark, over years and decades, turns them back into beginnings. We came down here braced for a place of death. And it is a place of death. But it is also, just as truly, the place where death is most completely refused, where nothing is allowed to simply end. The abyss runs on death, and on the refusal, by the life it feeds, to let death be the final word. And this, I want to be clear, this is still not the bottom. This vast, slow, patient plain, fed by falling corpses, is merely the floor of the ordinary deep ocean. There are places that go far deeper. There are wounds in the seafloor that plunge kilometers below even the abyssal plain, into a darkness so extreme that for most of human history we assumed nothing could possibly survive there at all. We were about to be proven wrong. And the people who proved it nearly died doing so. Because now the story leaves the creatures for a moment and returns to us, to the handful of human beings who decided that they could not bear not knowing what was at the very bottom, and who climbed into fragile machines and went down into the dark to find out. For almost all of human history, we believed the deep ocean was dead. It seems absurd now, but it was the considered scientific opinion of serious people. In the middle of the 19th century, a respected naturalist named Edward Forbes dredged the depths of the Mediterranean, pulling up samples from deeper and deeper water, and he noticed that the deeper he went, the less life he found. So he drew a line, a reasonable, logical, completely wrong line, and declared that below about 500 or 600 meters, the ocean was lifeless. An azoic zone, he called it. A dead zone. A vast, black, sterile emptiness wrapping the entire bottom of the world, where the pressure was too great, the cold too deep, the darkness too total for anything to live. It was a comforting idea, in its way. It put a floor under our curiosity. It said, "The deep is empty, there is nothing down there, you may stop wondering." And then the cable came up covered in life. In the 1860s, a telegraph cable was hauled up from the floor of the Mediterranean for repairs, from a depth far below Forbes's supposed dead zone, and it came up encrusted with living creatures. Corals, worms, animals that had attached themselves and grown and thrived at depths where the science of the day insisted nothing could survive. The dead zone was not dead. It had never been dead. We had simply lacked the tools to see it, and so we had filled the dark with our assumptions, and our assumptions had been comfortable, and our assumptions had been wrong. That single moment, that cable, slick with impossible life, is one of the great quiet turning points in our understanding of our own planet. Because it meant the question was not whether life existed in the deep. The question was how far down it went. And there was only one way to find out. Someone was going to have to go. The trouble is the pressure. We keep returning to the pressure, and we will keep returning to it, because it is the central horror of the deep, the thing that makes the bottom of the ocean in some ways harder to reach than the surface of the moon. By the time you reach the deepest parts of the sea, nearly 11 kilometers down, the weight of the water above you presses with a force of more than 1,000 atmospheres, more than 1,000 times the pressure you feel right now. It is the equivalent of balancing the weight of dozens of jumbo jets on a single square meter. It is a force that does not crush a flooded vessel so much as implode it, collapse it inward in a fraction of a second, faster than thought, with a violence that leaves almost nothing behind. To survive that, you cannot simply build a stronger submarine. You have to build something closer to a deep-sea creature than a ship, something engineered around the pressure rather than against it. And in 1960, 2 men climbed inside exactly such a machine and tried to fall all the way to the bottom of the world. The vessel was called the Trieste, and it looked nothing like the sleek submarines of the imagination. It was, in essence, a giant float, an enormous tank of gasoline, lighter than water, that gave the craft its buoyancy, with a tiny, almost unbearably small steel sphere hanging beneath it, just large enough for 2 men to crouch inside. The walls of that sphere were thick steel, and the single window was a cone of plexiglass, and into that cramped, cold, claustrophobic ball climbed a Swiss engineer named Jacques Piccard and a U.S. Navy lieutenant named Don Walsh. Their target was the deepest known point in all the oceans of the Earth, a slot in the floor of the Western Pacific called the Challenger Deep, at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. They began to sink, and the descent took hours, hours of falling, slowly through every layer we have already traveled, the light dying above them, the cold seeping through the steel, the darkness becoming total. Down through the twilight, down through the midnight, down past the abyssal plain, down into a place no human eyes had ever been. And somewhere near the bottom, at a depth where the pressure was almost beyond comprehension, they heard a sharp, cracking sound. And the whole vessel shuddered. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine being sealed inside a steel ball the size of a small closet, 10 kilometers beneath the surface of the ocean, with more pressure bearing down on you than almost any human-made object had ever endured. And hearing something crack, the 2 men did not know what had broken. They did not know if it was the beginning of the end, if the next sound would be the implosion that erased them both in an instant, faster than they could feel it. There was no rescue possible. There was no surfacing in time. If the sphere failed, they would simply cease, and no one would even be able to recover what was left. They decided to continue. I think about that decision a great deal. 2 men, in the dark, at the bottom of the world, hearing the sound of something cracking, and choosing to go down anyway, because they had come too far, because the bottom was so close, because some hungers in the human animal are stronger than the fear of death. There is a particular kind of courage that the deep demands, and it is not the loud kind. It is the quiet decision, made in a cold, cramped sphere with no possibility of rescue, that knowing is worth more than safety, that to come all this way and turn back would be a kind of failure worse than dying. We are the only creature on this planet that does this. No other animal descends into the crushing dark out of sheer need to understand. The fish that live down there were driven by hunger, by survival, by the slow pressures of evolution. We went down for no reason at all, except that we could not bear not to know what was there. It is one of the strangest and most human things about us, this willingness to risk everything, not for food, not for safety, not for territory, but simply to see. They went on. And the crack, it turned out, had been a window in the entry tunnel, not the sphere itself, a frightening but survivable failure. And finally, after a fall of nearly 7 miles straight down, the Trieste settled gently onto the floor of the Challenger Deep, raising a soft cloud of pale silt in the deepest place on Earth. And there, in that silt, in the deepest, coldest, most crushing point in all the oceans of the world, in a place we had once declared too hostile for any life at all, Pickard looked out through the window and saw something move. He reported a flatfish, a creature that looked to his eyes like a sole or a flounder, lying on the bottom and then swimming slowly away from the lights. Scientists have debated for decades whether what he saw was truly a fish or perhaps a sea cucumber glimpsed in difficult conditions. At that depth, with that small a window, certainty is hard. But it almost doesn't matter which it was, because the meaning was the same, and it was overwhelming. There was life here, at the very bottom, in the place we had been most certain was empty. Wherever we have gone in the ocean, however deep, however cold, however crushing, something has already been there, living, waiting, long before we arrived to be astonished by it. The dead zone was never dead. The bottom of the world was never empty. Every limit we ever imagined for life, the ocean had quietly already crossed, millions of years before we worked up the courage to look. And here is the strangest part of the Trieste's story, the part that says something uncomfortable about us. After that single dive in 1960, after 2 men risked their lives to touch the deepest point on the planet, almost nobody went back. For more than half a century, no human being returned to the Challenger Deep. We landed 12 people on the moon in that same span. We sent probes to the outer planets. And the deepest place on our own world, we visited once, and then largely left alone for 52 years, until a filmmaker named James Cameron made the dive solo in 2012, and a small handful of others have managed it since. We know the far side of the moon better than we know the bottom of our own sea. We have more detailed maps of Mars than of the floor of the Pacific. The deepest place on Earth has been visited by fewer people than have stood on the summit of Everest in a single crowded morning. The deep is not far away. It is right here, beneath every ship, beneath every wave, a few kilometers straight down from almost anywhere on the planet, and it remains, even now, even after everything, one of the last truly unknown places left to us. So when we ask what lives in the deepest parts of the ocean, we are not asking a settled question with a tidy answer. We are asking about a frontier we have barely touched. Almost everything down there is undescribed. Every expedition that goes to the trenches comes back with creatures no human has ever seen before, sometimes dozens of them in a single trip, new species hauled up or filmed in the dark, named for the first time, photographed for the first time, added to a catalog of life that we now understand to be radically, humblingly incomplete. And the trenches, the places like the one the Trieste fell into, are not just deeper. They are different. They are their own world, sealed off at the bottom of the abyss, with their own creatures and their own rules and their own particular kind of strangeness. The hadal zone, we call it, named for Hades, the underworld, the realm of the dead. Below 6,000 meters. the deepest of the deep. And against every expectation, it is full of life. The hadal zone is not really a layer at all. It is a collection of wounds. The other zones we have traveled through, the twilight, the midnight, the abyss, wrap around the entire planet in continuous sheets like the layers of an onion. But the hadal zone is different. It exists only in the trenches, the deep, narrow scars where one of the great plates of the Earth's crust is sliding beneath another, dragging the seafloor down with it into gashes that plunge far below the surrounding abyssal plain. There are only a few dozen of these places in all the world. They are scattered across the ocean floor like isolated valleys at the bottom of an already bottomless dark, separated from one another by vast stretches of shallower seabed, each one a little world unto itself, cut off, alone. And that isolation matters more than it sounds, because it means that the creatures of one trench may be entirely cut off from the creatures of another, that each of these abyssal valleys may be evolving its own private caste of life, its own species found nowhere else on Earth, marooned at the bottom of the sea like the inhabitants of islands too far apart to ever touch. We are only beginning to understand how true this is. Every trench we explore in detail seems to hold things that exist in that trench and nowhere else. The hadal zone is not one place. It is dozens of separate, lonely experiments in survival, each running independently in the dark, each having quietly arrived at its own answers. Think of them as islands, but the loneliest islands imaginable. An island in the sun, however remote, at least shares the same sky, the same rain, the same drifting birds and seeds and storms with every other island on Earth. But a trench is sealed off below kilometers of crushing water, separated from the next trench by vast stretches of seabed its inhabitants can never cross, with no birds, no seeds, no wind to carry life from one to another. A creature evolving at the bottom of one trench is as cut off from the creature at the bottom of the next trench as if they lived on different planets. And so each trench has become its own small, sealed world, running its own private experiment in how to be alive, in a darkness that has never once been touched by anything from the trench next door. There may be species down there, whole families of creatures that exist in a single trench and have never existed anywhere else in the 4 billion-year history of life on Earth, and never will. We have barely visited most of these trenches even once. We do not know what is in them. We only know that whatever is almost certainly found nowhere else in the universe. And the central problem they are all answering is once again the pressure. But here it reaches a level that does something genuinely strange, something that, when scientists first understood it, changed the way we think about the limits of life itself. At the bottom of the deepest trenches, the pressure is so immense that it begins to interfere with the molecules of life directly. Not by crushing the creature. Deep sea animals have no air spaces to collapse. Their bodies are mostly water, and water barely compresses, so the brute force of crushing is not the real danger. The real danger is subtler and far more profound. At these pressures, the proteins that every living thing depends on, the molecular machines that fold and twist and do the work of keeping a cell alive, begin to deform. The pressure pushes on them, warps them, stops them from folding into the shapes they need in order to function. Life is, at its most basic level, a matter of molecules holding the right shape, and the deep trenches press hard enough to bend those shapes out of true. So the creatures that live there had to solve a problem at the scale of individual molecules. And they did it with a substance whose name almost no one knows, but which turns out to be one of the quiet keys to the deepest life on Earth. It is a molecule called trimethylamine N oxide, but you don't need the name. You only need to understand what it does. It is a chemical that props the proteins up. It crowds in around them and stabilizes their shape, bracing them against the deforming weight of the pressure, like an invisible scaffolding holding a building upright in a storm. And here is the beautiful, eerie part. The deeper a fish lives, the more of this molecule it carries in its body. As you descend through the trenches, fish after fish, the concentration of this protective compound rises, steadily, predictably, in lockstep with the depth, as if each creature carries, written in its own chemistry, a precise measurement of how deep it has learned to live. But the molecule has a limit. And the limit is one of the most haunting numbers in all of biology. If you keep adding this protective compound to a fish's body, its concentration eventually reaches a point where the fish's cells would have the same chemistry as the seawater around it, and at that point, the whole system stops working. Water would no longer flow correctly across the fish's cells. The very chemistry of life would break. And scientists calculated the depth at which that limit is reached. The depth at which a fish, no matter how perfectly adapted, simply cannot pack in enough protective molecules to survive the pressure. That depth is around 8,200 meters. And when we finally sent cameras down into the deepest trenches to look, when we descended below 8,200 meters and kept going toward the very bottom, we found that there were no fish. None. Below that line, in the deepest reaches of the deepest trenches, the fish simply stop. Not because of cold, not because of darkness, not because of a lack of food, but because, at that depth, the molecule that holds their proteins together would have to be present in a quantity that life cannot survive. The prediction made on a chalkboard, from the chemistry of a single molecule, matched what the cameras found at the bottom of the sea. There is a hard floor to where a fish can exist, and we calculated it before we ever saw it, and the ocean confirmed it. I find that almost unbearably profound. Somewhere down there, in the deepest trenches on Earth, there is an invisible boundary, a line with no marker, no wall, no visible change, below which no fish has ever lived or ever could. Above it, the deepest fish in the world drift through the black, perfectly at home in pressure that would destroy a submarine. And below it, a realm even fish cannot enter, a kingdom belonging to creatures even simpler and even hardier, the absolute frontier of vertebrate life on this planet. The fish reach down as far as the laws of chemistry will let them, and there they stop, and beyond them lies a darkness even they cannot follow. And the fish that live right at that edge, the deepest fish ever recorded, are not the monsters you might imagine. This is one of the great surprises of the trenches, and one of the gentlest. We descend, expecting the deepest fish on Earth to be the most fearsome, the most armored, the most nightmarish. And instead, at the very bottom of the living world, we find the snailfish. They are small, they are soft, they are pale and almost translucent, with loose gelatinous bodies that look, in the camera lights, oddly delicate, almost tender, like something that should not survive a moment at these depths, drifting calmly through a pressure that could implode steel. They have no scales. They have large, watery bodies that flex with the pressure instead of fighting it. Their bones are reduced, lightened, partly uncalcified, because rigid structure is a liability where everything must bend. They are, in every way, the opposite of armor. They survive the most extreme pressure on the planet, not by being hard, but by being soft, by giving in to the deep so completely that the deep has nothing left to break. There is a lesson buried in that, I think, though I'll let you find it yourself. Because we came down here, all the way down, expecting that to survive the most extreme place on Earth, a creature would have to be the hardest, the strongest, the most armored, the most ferocious thing imaginable. That is the logic of the surface world, the logic of strength against force, of building higher walls against greater pressure, and the deepest fish on the planet quietly refutes all of it. The snailfish does not resist the crushing weight. It lets the weight in. It fills itself with water that bends instead of breaking. It lightens its bones until there is almost nothing rigid left to shatter. It becomes so soft, so yielding, so unresisting that the most destructive pressure on Earth finds nothing in it to destroy. It survives the unsurvivable by refusing to fight it. And it does this not in some sheltered corner of the deep, but at the very edge of where life itself can exist, closer to that absolute boundary than any other creature with a backbone has ever managed to live. The toughest place in the world is ruled, at its very bottom, by one of the gentlest, softest, most fragile-looking creatures there is. The deep does not reward hardness. The deep rewards the willingness to yield. The hadal snailfish gather at the very bottom of the trenches, in the deepest reaches where any vertebrate can live, and they feed on the tiny scavenging crustaceans that swarm the trench floor, little shrimp-like amphipods that arrive in clouds wherever food falls. The cleanup crew of the deepest deep. And those amphipods are themselves extraordinary, because they have learned to thrive where the food rain from above has dwindled to almost nothing, scavenging the rare carcass that tumbles all the way down into the trench, breeding in numbers that seem impossible for a place so empty. And some of those amphipods, in the deepest trenches, grow strangely, enormously large. On the abyssal plain above, their relatives are the size of a fingernail. But down in the trenches, in certain deep gorges, they swell to the size of your hand and beyond, pale, armored, alien giants, drifting through water that would kill almost anything from the world above. We call it abyssal gigantism, this tendency for creatures of the cold and crushing deep to grow far larger than their shallow cousins, and we do not fully understand it. The cold may slow their lives and let them grow longer. The pressure may favor larger cells. The scarcity may reward those who can store more and wait longer. We have theories. We do not have certainty. The deep keeps its reasons. Uncomfortable. But the giant amphipods of the trenches taught us something else. Something that arrived recently, and that should trouble anyone who hears it. When scientists captured these creatures from the very deepest trenches on the planet, from the Mariana Trench, from places nearly 11 kilometers down, from the most remote and isolated environments that exist anywhere on the surface of the Earth, places no human had ever been, places utterly cut off from the world above, and analyzed the fat in their bodies, they found something waiting there. They found us. In the tissues of creatures living at the very bottom of the deepest trench in the world, they found man-made pollutants, industrial chemicals, compounds that were manufactured in factories, used in the surface world, banned decades ago, and that had drifted, somehow, all the way down, falling on the marine snow, accumulating in the bodies of the scavengers, concentrating in the fat of animals that have never seen the sun and never will. The levels in some of these deep trench creatures were higher than in animals living in heavily polluted coastal rivers. Higher in the deepest, most untouched place on Earth than in the visibly poisoned waters near our own cities. There is no longer anywhere on this planet that we have not reached. We have not been to the bottom of the Mariana Trench more than a handful of times in all of human history. But our chemistry has. Our waste has arrived in places our bodies never will, settled into the flesh of creatures we have never named, in the deepest, darkest, most isolated wounds in the floor of the world. The hadal zone is the most remote environment on Earth, and it is already contaminated by us. We managed to touch the bottom of the world with our pollution long before we managed to touch it with our hands. And so the question we began with shifts again, quietly, the way it keeps shifting the deeper we go. What lives in the deepest parts of the ocean? Soft, pale fish that survive by surrendering. Giant scavengers grown strange in the cold. Worlds within worlds, sealed in trenches, each evolving alone, and, threaded invisibly through all of it now, the traces of a species that lives kilometers above and has never seen any of it, present in the deepest dark without ever having gone there. We are not separate from the deep. We never were. We thought it was another world, far below us, sealed away. And it turns out, the deep has been quietly drinking the runoff of ours all along. But there is something else down here. Something I have been holding back. Because everything we have seen so far, every creature, every adaptation, the whole vast machinery of the deep, has run on a single source of energy. The death of the sunlit world above. The marine snow, the whale falls, the scraps drifting down from the light. Every living thing we have met has been, in the end, a scavenger of the sun's leftovers. And then, in 1977, we found a place in the deep where that wasn't true at all, a place where life was not living off the sun, a place where life had found another way entirely, and in doing so, quietly rewrote our understanding of what life is, where it can begin, and whether the sun was ever really necessary at all. In February of 1977, a small submersible called Alvin was working its way along the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, near the Galapagos Islands, more than 2 kilometers down. The scientists aboard were not biologists. They were geologists. They had come to study the seafloor itself, the place where the Earth's crust is born, where molten rock wells up from inside the planet and hardens into new ocean floor. They expected rock. They expected mud. They expected the cold, dark, sparse, almost empty bottom that everything we knew about the deep had taught them to expect. Nobody had sent biologists, because nobody imagined there would be much biology to find. 2 kilometers down, far from any whale fall, on the bare volcanic rock of the deep seafloor, there was no reason to expect anything but the thinnest scattering of life. And then, their instruments found a patch of water that was warm. Warm, at the bottom of the ocean, where the temperature never changes, where the cold is older than civilization, the sensors found water that was warmer than it had any right to be, and the submersible turned toward it, lights cutting through the dark, and the crew looked out through the small windows, and what they saw stopped the conversation inside the sphere completely. There was an oasis on the bottom of the world. Out of the black volcanic rock, hot, mineral-rich water was billowing up from inside the Earth and clustered around it, packed so densely they could barely see the rock beneath, was life. An eruption of it. Vast fields of enormous clams, larger than dinner plates. Mussels heaped in living mounds, crabs picking their way through the crowd. And rising from the seafloor and forests, swaying in the warm currents, were creatures the scientists could not even identify at first. Great white tubes, taller than a person, each one tipped with a plume of brilliant, blood-red flesh that withdrew and emerged from the tube like something breathing. Giant tube worms, hundreds of them, thousands. A teeming, crowded, riotous garden of life, blooming in total darkness, 2 kilometers beneath the waves, where every law of the deep said there should be almost nothing at all. The scientists, the story goes, were so unprepared for biology that they had to preserve some of the first specimens in vodka, because they had not brought the proper chemicals. They had come to look at rocks. They had found the most important biological discovery of the century. Try to put yourself in that small steel sphere with them. You are a geologist. You have trained your whole life to read the language of rock, the cooling of magma, the spreading of the seafloor, the slow machinery of a planet. You have come down 2 kilometers into the dark expecting bare stone and cold mud, and you are excited, in the quiet way of scientists, about the geology. And then the water warms, and you turn toward it, and your lights fall on a garden. An impossible, riotous, blooming garden of giant clams and swaying blood-red plumes, in a place where your entire understanding of biology says there should be almost nothing. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when people are looking at something they have no framework for. The recordings from those early dives capture it. The long pauses, the half-finished sentences, the dawning realization in people's voices that they are looking at something that should not be there, that no one predicted, that is going to require the textbooks to be rewritten. They had gone down to confirm what they already knew about the floor of the world. They surfaced having discovered that they had not known the floor of the world at all. And the place itself, the vent, is its own kind of extreme. The water gushing up from some of these vents is not merely warm. At the hottest of them, the black smokers, it emerges superheated, far hotter than boiling, kept liquid only by the immense pressure, billowing up black with dissolved minerals that precipitate into towering chimneys of rock, some of them taller than buildings, building themselves up from the seafloor in the dark. Right at the vent, the water can be hot enough to melt the instruments we lower into it. A few meters away, it is back to the near-freezing cold of the deep. And in the narrow band between, in the thin margin between scalding and freezing, between the planet's hot blood and the abyss's eternal cold, life crowds in, packed as densely as anywhere in the ocean, thriving in a knife edge of conditions that would kill it instantly on either side. The tube worms grow fastest of almost any marine invertebrate known, racing upward in the brief richness around the vent. It is one of the most extreme environments that life has ever colonized. And life has not merely survived it, life has flourished there, more abundantly than almost anywhere in the sunlit sea. Because here is the thing that made this more than a beautiful surprise. Here is the thing that reached up out of the deep and shook the foundations of how we understood life itself. This oasis was not living off the sun. Everything else in the entire ocean, everything we had seen on our whole long descent, every fish and worm and scavenger, the whole vast pyramid of deep sea life, had been, in the end, eating sunlight. The marine snow, the whale falls, the scraps drifting down, all of it traced back, eventually, to plants in the sunlit surface capturing the energy of the sun. Sunlight was the foundation. We believed, completely and reasonably, that sunlight was the foundation of all life on Earth, that somewhere up the chain, every living thing depended on a star. But the tube worms had no mouths, no guts, no way to eat at all. They could not be feeding on marine snow. They could not be feeding on each other. And they were not, even distantly, living off the sun. They were living off the planet. The hot water gushing from the vents was loaded with chemicals from deep inside the Earth, and in particular with hydrogen sulfide, the chemical that gives rotten eggs their stench, a substance that is poisonous to almost all the life we know. And down in the darkness, certain bacteria had learned to do something extraordinary. They had learned to pull energy out of that chemical directly, to feed on the raw chemistry of the Earth's interior, with no sunlight involved at any step. We call it chemosynthesis, the mirror image of the photosynthesis that powers the surface world. Instead of building life from light, these bacteria build life from poison, from the planet's own hot breath, from chemicals welling up out of the rock. And the giant tube worms? They had made a bargain with those bacteria, the same kind of bargain we have seen again and again in the deep. Inside their bodies, the tube worms house billions of these chemical-feeding bacteria, sheltering them, feeding them the raw materials they need. And in exchange, the bacteria feed the worm. The blood-red plume is packed with a special form of hemoglobin that can carry both oxygen and the poisonous hydrogen sulfide at once, ferrying them down to the bacteria inside. The worm is, in a sense, a garden, a living vessel built to farm a colony of bacteria that eat the chemistry of the Earth. It has no need of the sun. It has no need of food falling from above. It has tapped directly into the energy of the planet itself. Do you understand what this meant? Do you understand why the scientists in that submersible were looking at something far larger than a strange new animal? It meant that life does not require the sun. For all of human history, we had assumed that sunlight was the source, that life was, fundamentally, a phenomenon of light, that a living world needed a star to feed it. And here, 2 kilometers down in the eternal dark, was an entire thriving ecosystem that proved otherwise. Life could be built on chemistry alone. Life could feed on the heat and the minerals of a planet's interior, in total darkness, completely independent of any sun. And the moment that became clear, the universe got a great deal more crowded. Because if life does not need sunlight, if it can survive on the chemical energy of a planet's hot interior, in darkness, under crushing pressure. Then suddenly, the list of places where life might exist explodes. Think of the icy moons of the outer solar system. Europa, circling Jupiter, with a global ocean of liquid water sealed beneath kilometers of ice, kept warm by the flexing pull of its giant planet. Enceladus, orbiting Saturn, venting plumes of water into space from a hidden ocean below its frozen shell. These worlds get almost no sunlight. Their oceans are sealed in permanent darkness beneath the ice. And for a long time, that seemed to rule them out as homes for life. But the tube worms changed the question. Because if those alien oceans have hydrothermal vents on their seafloors, if there is hot, chemical-rich water welling up from the rocky cores of those frozen moons, the way it wells up from the floor of our own deep ocean, then they might have exactly the conditions that the tube worms thrive in. Darkness would be no obstacle. The absence of sunlight would be no obstacle. Life might be down there, right now, clustered around alien vents on the floor of a sea no light has ever touched, hundreds of millions of kilometers from Earth, living the same way the tube worms live, off the chemistry of a world. We went looking at the bottom of our own ocean, and we found a clue about whether we are alone in the universe. And it goes deeper still. Because some scientists now believe that the vents are not just a place where life can survive without the sun. They believe the vents may be where life began, that the first living things on Earth, nearly 4 billion years ago, may not have emerged in some sunlit pool at the surface, but down in the dark, around hydrothermal vents on the floor of the primordial ocean, where the chemistry of the young planet provided everything the first faint flickers of life would have needed. Energy. Minerals, the right molecules, concentrated in the right place, sheltered from the violence of the surface world above. If that is true, and it is one of the leading ideas for how life on Earth began, then the deep, dark, crushing bottom of the ocean is not some hostile frontier that life reluctantly crept into. It is the cradle. It is where we all come from. The sunlit surface, the green fields, the blue sky, the entire bright world we think of as home, all of it would be the late arrival, the colony, the offshoot. And the true homeland of life, the place it first opened its eyes in the dark, would be down there, in the eternal night, around the hot vents on the floor of the deep, where the tube worms still bloom today in the same darkness that may have given birth to everything. We climbed out of the deep. We crawled up into the light, eventually, over billions of years, and we built our civilization on the thin sunlit skin of the planet, and we came to believe that this, the light, the surface, the dry land, was the real world, and the deep was the strange, alien, hostile exception. But it may be exactly the other way around. The deep may be the original. We may be the strangers. The bright, warm, sunlit world we love and call home may be the brief, beautiful exception, and the dark, the cold, the crushing, patient deep may be the rule the universe runs on. Most of the water on Earth is dark. Most of the living space is dark. Life may have begun in the dark, and out there, around other stars, on the floors of frozen alien seas, life may be living in the dark right now, having never known a sun, never needing one, exactly as it does at the bottom of our own ocean. We went down to ask what lives in the deepest parts of the sea. And the deep answered with a much older, much stranger truth, that the dark was never the absence of the world. The dark was the world. And we are the ones who left it. There is a war happening in the deep ocean. It has been happening for millions of years. We have never witnessed it directly. We only know it happens because of the scars. When whalers in the old days hauled the great sperm whales up onto their decks, those enormous, square-headed hunters of the deep, the largest predators with teeth that have ever lived, they noticed something strange on the skin. Circular marks. Rings of torn and scarred flesh, sometimes the size of a dinner plate, sometimes larger, carved into the hide around the whale's head and mouth. Round wounds, in patterns. And when they understood what was making them, the understanding came with a chill, because those scars could only have been left by one thing. Suckers. Enormous suckers, lined with rings of serrated, tooth-like edges. The sperm whale was coming up from the deep, marked by something that had fought back. Something with arms thick enough and suckers large enough to leave wounds the size of a human face on the body of the largest toothed predator on Earth. The sperm whale is one of the great athletes of the deep. It is a surface-breathing mammal. Like us, it must return to the air to breathe, and yet it dives down into the midnight zone and beyond, holding its breath for over an hour, descending to 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers, into the cold and the dark and the crushing pressure. And it does this not occasionally, but constantly, day after day, for its entire life. It goes down into that black world deliberately, repeatedly, to hunt. And down there, in the dark where we cannot follow, it meets the thing that scars it. For most of human history, that thing was barely more than a legend. Sailors had told stories for centuries of vast tentacled monsters rising from the deep to drag ships beneath the waves, of the kraken, of arms reaching up out of the black to pull men down. We dismissed them as the inventions of frightened, superstitious men, the way we dismiss most things we have not yet seen. But the stories, it turned out, were not entirely invented. They were exaggerations of something real, something enormous, something that does live down there in the dark, and that we would not properly see alive for a very, very long time. The giant squid is real. The colossal squid is real, and it is even larger. These are animals with bodies that can stretch the length of a bus, with eyes the size of dinner plates, the largest eyes of any animal that has ever existed. Eyes evolved to gather the faintest scraps of light in the blackness, perhaps even to detect the dim glow stirred up by an approaching sperm whale moving through the bioluminescent plankton. They have 8 arms and 2 longer tentacles, lined with those serrated suckers, and a sharp beak at the center, capable of tearing flesh. They are intelligent in the strange distributed way that all cephalopods are intelligent, much of their nervous system spread out through their arms, each limb half thinking for itself. And here is what astonishes me. We knew the giant squid existed for over a century, from dead specimens washed ashore, from remains found in the bellies of sperm whales, but we did not capture a single photograph of a living giant squid in its natural habitat until 2004. Not 1904. 2004. Within the lifetime of most people watching this, the largest invertebrate predator in the ocean, an animal the size of a bus, a creature that has haunted our myths for 1,000 years, had never once been photographed alive in the deep. We had been to the moon. We had split the atom. We had mapped the human genome. And we had never seen this enormous animal alive in the place it lives. When we finally did, when a Japanese team finally lowered the right bait to the right depth and waited, the images showed an animal far more powerful and far more active than the limp dead specimens had suggested. Not a slow, drifting monster, but a fast, aggressive hunter, striking at the bait, wrapping it in those long tentacles, fighting. And it occurred to people, looking at those first images, that this animal had been down there the whole time. Through every century of human history, through every war and empire and age, this enormous predator had been hunting in the dark beneath our ships the entire time, and we had simply never seen it, because it lived in the one place we could not go. How many more are there? That is the question that should sit with you. The colossal squid was only properly described in recent decades. We are still, today, regularly discovering creatures in the deep that are entirely new to science, not small things, not just microbes, but substantial animals, fish and squid and jellyfish and stranger things, hauled up or filmed for the first time. The deep ocean is the largest habitat on Earth, and it is the least explored, and every serious expedition that goes down comes back with the names of things no one had ever recorded before. Which means the honest answer to what lives in the deepest parts of the ocean includes a vast, uncomfortable category: things we have not met yet. Things that are down there right now, living their lives in the dark, that no human has ever seen, that have no name, that will go on living and dying in the black, whether or not we ever find them. The catalog is radically incomplete. We are not describing a finished world. We are describing the small lit edge of an enormous dark one and confessing how little of it we have managed to glimpse. And some of what we have glimpsed seems to come from another reality entirely. Let me tell you about a few of the creatures of the deep that, even now, even to the scientists who study them, feel almost impossible. There is a jellyfish in the deep that, when threatened, does not flee. It explodes into light. A burst of brilliant blue bioluminescence flares out from its body in a pinwheel of spinning light, a living firework detonating in the black, meant to startle a predator, or, more cunningly, to summon an even larger predator to come and attack whatever is attacking it. It defends itself by lighting a beacon in the dark that says, "Something is hunting me here. Come and hunt it instead." A burglar alarm made of light, in a world where light is the rarest thing of all. There is a fish, the barreleye, with a head so transparent you can see directly into it. Its eyes are not on the sides of its head where you would expect. They are inside the head, pointing upward. Two glowing green orbs, visible through a clear dome of skin, scanning the darkness above for the faint silhouettes of prey drifting past against the dim glow of the far surface. For decades, we did not even understand what we were looking at, because every specimen we hauled up arrived with the delicate, transparent dome destroyed by the change in pressure. We only understood the barreleye properly when we finally filmed one alive and intact in the deep, and saw, for the first time, that its strange green eyes could rotate inside its own sea through skull. There are siphonophores, colonies that look like a single long, glowing creature, but are in fact made of many smaller organisms living and working together as one, drifting through the deep in chains that can stretch longer than a blue whale, making them, by some measures, among the longest animals on the entire planet. They are not one thing. They are a community pretending to be a body, hunting the dark in eerie, glowing unity. And there are things we have only seen once, glimpsed, filmed for a few seconds by a deep-sea camera, never seen again. Creatures that exist, in our entire record of them, as a single ghostly clip of something moving through the black, unidentified, unrepeated. There are animals known to science from one encounter. 1. A shape in the dark, here and then gone, swimming off into a vastness so enormous that the odds of ever finding that individual, or even its species, a second time, are almost nothing. Think about the loneliness of that, on both sides. A creature so rare, in a darkness so vast, that the entire knowledge of its existence rests on a few seconds of footage no one has ever been able to match. And us, a species that has mapped the stars and named the constellations and charted distant galaxies, utterly unable to find, a second time, an animal living right here, on our own planet, a few kilometers beneath our ships. The deep does not give itself up. That is the thing I keep coming back to. We have built every tool we can imagine, and still it withholds itself. Still it keeps almost all of its inhabitants hidden. Still it lets us see only the smallest fraction, only what happens to drift past our few small lights in all that endless black. And the creatures it does show us are telling us something, if we are willing to hear it. The transparent heads, the burglar alarm jellyfish, the colonies pretending to be animals, the eyes the size of plates, the soft fish that survive by surrender, the worms that farm poison, the males that dissolve into their mates. None of these are mistakes. None of these are monsters in the way the old sailors meant. Every single one of them is a perfect, precise, hard-won answer to the question the deep has been asking for billions of years. How do you live here? How do you survive in the cold and the dark and the crushing weight, on almost no food, almost alone? And the deep has answered that question in more ways, and more strangely, and more beautifully than the bright surface world ever had to, because the surface had it easy. The surface had the sun. Down here, every creature had to invent its own way to be alive, and the inventions are so far beyond our imagination that we are still, after all this time, only beginning to read them. But there is one more thing the deep is hiding. And it is the largest thing of all. We have talked about the creatures. We have not yet talked about what they are part of. The single enormous system that connects the deep to every breath you take, every season you live through, every drop of rain that has ever fallen on your skin. The deep ocean is not a separate world after all. It is the engine of this one. And it is changing. There is a current in the ocean that no one can see, and it touches everything. It does not look like the currents you might imagine, the warm rivers in the sea, the surface streams that sailors have used for centuries. This one runs deep and slow and dark, and it wraps around the entire planet in a single immense continuous loop that takes more than 1,000 years to complete. We call it the global conveyor, the great ocean circulation, and it is one of the most important systems on Earth, and almost no one ever thinks about it, because it happens entirely out of sight, down in the cold and the dark we have been traveling through. Here is how it works, and why it should make the hair stand up on your arms a little. Up near the poles, in the freezing waters of the far north and the far south, the surface of the sea gets very cold and very salty. Cold because of the polar air, salty because when sea ice forms, it leaves its salt behind in the water beneath it. And cold, salty water is heavy, heavier than the water below it. So it sinks. In great silent columns, vast quantities of surface water plunge down into the deep at the poles, falling kilometers into the abyss, and then begin to creep along the bottom of the world, slow rivers of cold, dense water flowing across the abyssal plains, taking centuries to cross the oceans, eventually rising again, somewhere far away, to complete the loop. This deep circulation is the planet's circulatory system. It carries heat from the equator toward the poles, which is part of why the climates we live in are the climates they are. It carries oxygen down into the deep, which is the reason all those creatures we met, the snailfish, the tube worms, the scavengers on the abyssal plain, have oxygen to breathe at all, kilometers below the surface where no oxygen is made. And it carries something else, something that has become, in our lifetime, one of the most consequential facts about the entire planet. It carries carbon. It carries our carbon, down into the dark. The ocean has been absorbing an enormous fraction of the carbon dioxide we have poured into the atmosphere since we began burning coal and oil. Roughly a quarter of all of it, year after year, dissolves into the sea, and much of it is carried down by the sinking of those cold polar waters and by the endless rain of marine snow into the deep ocean, where it is locked away, out of the atmosphere. Sometimes for centuries, the deep ocean has been quietly protecting us. It has been swallowing the consequences of what we have done to the air, absorbing the heat, absorbing the carbon, slowing the warming of the surface world, buying us time we did not earn and mostly do not even know we were given. But it is not free. Nothing in the deep is free. We have seen that over and over on this descent. Every adaptation has a cost. Every survival is paid for. And the cost of the deep ocean swallowing our carbon is now beginning to come due, in two ways, both of them slow, both of them enormous, both of them happening right now, in the dark, where we cannot see them. The first is that the sea is becoming acid. When carbon dioxide dissolves in seawater, it forms a weak acid, and as the ocean absorbs more and more of our carbon, its chemistry is shifting growing steadily more acidic than it has been in millions of years. And acid eats shells. Acid eats the calcium carbonate structures that countless ocean creatures build their bodies from, the tiny plankton at the base of the entire food web, the very creatures whose falling bodies become the marine snow that feeds the deep. We are changing the chemistry of the largest habitat on Earth, from the bottom of the food chain up, and we are doing it faster than that chemistry has changed in an almost unimaginably long time. Uncomfortable. And the second cost is even quieter, even harder to see, and perhaps even more profound. As the surface of the ocean warms, and it is warming, the whole great circulation, the conveyor, may begin to slow. Warm water is lighter. It does not sink the way cold water sinks. And if the cold, dense, plunging columns at the poles begin to weaken, the entire deep circulation could slow, falter, change in ways we are only beginning to model. The system that carries oxygen into the deep. The system that distributes heat across the planet and gives us the climates we have built our entire civilization upon. The system that has, for thousands and thousands of years, run quietly in the dark beneath everything, asking nothing of us, holding the world in a balance we did not even know existed until we began, accidentally, to tip it. We are, I think, only now beginning to grasp the strangeness of our position. We live on the surface. We have always lived on the surface, in the light, on the thin, warm skin of the planet. And we have treated the deep as something separate from us, a distant, alien world, a place of monsters and mysteries, far below and far away, with nothing to do with our daily lives. But it was never separate. The deep ocean breathes the carbon out of our sky. The deep ocean sets the temperature of our seasons. The deep ocean's slow rain of dying plankton falling for millions of years helped build the very oil and gas we are now burning to warm it. The deep made the rules our whole world runs on, in the dark, where we never thought to look, and now, without ever meaning to, we have reached down into that dark and begun to change it. The pollutants in the trench amphipods, the carbon in the deep currents, the acid creeping up through the food web. We have touched the bottom of the world after all, in every way except with our own hands and our own eyes. And here is the part that I find quietly devastating. We are altering the deep ocean, the largest, oldest, most stable environment on the planet, a place whose temperature has not changed in thousands of years, a place that runs on cycles measured in centuries before we have even met most of the creatures that live there. Think about that sequence of events. We are changing the chemistry of a world we have not finished discovering. The species we are putting at risk down there include species we have not yet named, have not yet seen, do not yet know exist. There are almost certainly animals in the deep ocean right now that will quietly vanish, that will be pushed past some threshold by the warming, the acidifying, the slow shifting of the world they were perfectly adapted to, without ever once having been recorded by a single human being. They will arrive in the world and leave it again, after millions of years of existence, in the gap between our reaching the deep and our understanding it. Discovered and undiscovered at the same time. Lost before they were ever found. And there is one more thing coming for the deep, and it is the most direct of all. Because down on the abyssal plains, those vast, slow, ancient fields of mud we traveled across, the ones fed by falling death, the ones that take 100 years to receive a single drifting particle, there are metals, scattered across the deep seafloor. In some regions in staggering quantities, lie small dark lumps called manganese nodules, knobs of rock, built up over millions of years, layer by impossibly slow layer, around a tiny fragment of shell or bone, growing at a rate of perhaps a few millimeters every million years. They are among the slowest forming objects on the entire planet, and they are rich in exactly the metals our modern world is hungriest for, the metals in our batteries, our electronics, the machinery of the future we are trying to build. And so there are companies, right now, designing enormous machines to go down and harvest them, to drive across the abyssal plain, that silent, patient, almost untouched floor of the world, and scrape up the nodules, churning the seabed, raising clouds of sediment into water that has been still for 1,000 years. The nodules themselves are a habitat. Creatures live on them, anchored to them, found nowhere else, and the seafloor around them holds communities of life so slow, so ancient, so finely tuned to a world that never changes, that a single pass of a mining machine could erase, in an afternoon, an ecosystem that took longer than human history to assemble, and that may take longer than human history to ever return, if it returns at all. Uncomfortable. We are deciding, in our lifetimes, whether to begin industrializing the last truly untouched environment on Earth, whether to bring our machines down into the one place they have never been, and we are deciding it, as we decide so much about the deep, in near total ignorance of what is actually down there, weighing metals we can hold against creatures we have never seen, in a darkness we have barely begun to map. So when we ask what lives in the deepest parts of the ocean, we are not asking an idle question, a curiosity, a piece of trivia about a faraway place. We are asking about a world that holds the chemistry of our sky and the temperature of our seasons in its dark hands. A world that may be the cradle of all life. A world we are changing before we understand it, and may begin to strip mine before we have finished meeting its inhabitants. The deep is not separate from us. It never was, and what happens to it will happen, eventually, slowly, in ways we are only starting to trace, to us. But I want to bring us back now, down out of the systems and the stakes and the consequences, back to the creatures, back to the dark, because there is a final strangeness waiting down there. A last set of inhabitants of the deep that we have not yet met. And they are, in some ways, the most unsettling of all, because they ask the oldest question there is. What does it mean to die? And is it really the end? Down in the deep, for some creatures, the answer is not what you would expect. Time moves differently in the deep. We have felt this already, in pieces, all the way down. The water at the bottom that last saw the sky 1,000 years ago, the nodules that grow a few millimeters in 1,000,000 years, the currents measured in centuries. But it goes further than the water and the rock. It reaches into the creatures themselves, into how long they live, into how slowly their lives unwind. And down at the bottom of the world, where the cold never lifts and the food almost never comes, life has learned to stretch itself out across spans of time that make a human lifetime look like a single afternoon. There are clams on the deep seafloor that may live for 500 years. There are corals down in the cold dark, not the bright reef corals of the sunlit shallows, but deep, slow, lightless corals that are among the oldest living things on the entire planet, individual colonies that have been quietly alive for 4,000 years and more. 4,000 years. There are deep corals alive in the dark right now that were already old when the pyramids were being built, that have stood on the floor of the ocean through the entire rise and fall of every empire that has ever existed, growing imperceptibly, fraction by fraction, in a darkness where nothing ever changes, where there are no seasons, no days, no events to mark the passage of all that time. And there is a shark in the cold, deep waters of the north, the Greenland shark, that we now believe may live for 3, 4, perhaps 500 years. A single one of these sharks, swimming slowly through the dark, cold water today, may have been born before the telescope was invented, may have been alive when sailing ships still ruled the seas, may predate every person you have ever heard of who is not in a history book. They grow about 1 centimeter a year. They do not even reach maturity, do not even become capable of having young, until they are over 1 century old. A Greenland shark that is 150 years old is, in its own terms, still young. Imagine the patience of a life like that. Imagine living so slowly that a century is your adolescence. Imagine moving through the cold dark for 400 years, in a world without sunlight or seasons, where almost nothing ever happens and almost nothing ever needs to. We are creatures of frantic, brief, blazing lives. We burn hot and fast, and we are gone in a handful of decades. And down in the deep, in the cold, life found the opposite strategy entirely. Burn cold. Burn slow. Spend so little energy. Move so little. Live so quietly that a single life can outlast civilizations. And then there is the creature that, more than any other, makes you question what death even means. There is a jellyfish, a small one, barely the size of a fingernail, that appears to have found a way out. Under stress, when it is injured or starving or old, instead of dying, this jellyfish can do something almost no other animal can. It can reverse, its cells transform, its body reorganizes, and it reverts to an earlier stage of its own life, sinking back to the seafloor and becoming, in essence, young again, a polyp, the juvenile form it had long ago left behind, from which it can grow up all over again. In principle, it can do this again and again. In principle, barring being eaten or destroyed, it does not have to die of age at all. We have, with grim and not entirely accurate poetry, called it the immortal jellyfish. It is not truly immortal, of course. It can still be eaten, still be killed, still be destroyed. And it lives much of its life in shallower water than the deep we have been exploring. But the principle it embodies, that the wall between life stages, even the wall between aging and youth, even perhaps the wall we think of as final, is not as fixed as we assume. That principle haunts the whole story of the deep. Because the deep is where life has had the most time, the most stability, the most uninterrupted billions of years to experiment with what is possible. And what the deep keeps showing us is that the rules we thought were laws are merely the local habits of the warm, bright surface where we happen to live. Death comes fast at the surface. Life is brief and frantic at the surface. The surface taught us those things, and we mistook them for the truth about all life everywhere. But the deep, slow and cold and patient and vast, has been quietly running a different experiment the whole time, one where life can last for thousands of years, where age can perhaps be reversed, where a creature can dissolve into its mate and never truly be separate again, where bones come alive and poison becomes food and the dark is full of light. And I think this is, in the end, the deepest reason the ocean unsettles us. Not the pressure, not the darkness, not the strange and frightening shapes of its creatures. It is that the deep is a place where almost everything we believe to be fundamental about life, that it needs the sun, that it is brief, that death is final, that the bright warm world is where things truly happen, turns out to be merely our own small local story. The deep does not share our assumptions. It never agreed to them. It has been down there the whole time, living by older and stranger rules, indifferent to everything we thought we knew. We are very young as a species. We have been looking at the deep for the merest sliver of time. The Greenland shark swimming in the cold dark right now may, in a single life, outlast the entire span between our first crude descent in the Trieste and whatever we eventually become. The deep corals were old before our oldest myths. The water at the bottom is older than our oldest cities. And against all of that ancient, patient, lightless depth, we are a brief flicker of curiosity on the surface, lowering our small machines into the dark for a few decades, catching glimpses, naming a fraction, understanding almost nothing, and changing it anyway. We have come a long way down, you and I. We left the lying surface. With its silver calm and its comfortable certainties, we passed through the twilight, where creatures erase themselves with light. We crossed into the eternal midnight, where the dragonfish hunts in a color no one else can see, and the anglerfish dissolves its mate into its own body rather than be alone. We drifted down across the abyssal plain, where the dead of the upper world fall as endless snow, and an entire civilization can rise and fade on the bones of a single whale. We reached the trenches, where soft pale fish survive the crushing weight by surrendering to it, and found our own poison waiting there ahead of us. We met the tube worms blooming in the dark around the hot breath of the planet, living without the sun, hinting that life itself may have begun down here, that the dark may be our true and original home. And we are not at the bottom yet. Not quite. There is still further to go. There is always still further to go. That is the final truth of the deep. The one I have been saving. Because no matter how deep we descend, the dark goes deeper. I want you to try something. It is uncomfortable, but it will change how you understand everything we have seen. Close your eyes, not literally, you're listening, keep them where they are, but in your mind, take away your sight. Now take away the warmth of the air on your skin. Now take away every sound except a low, constant pressure that never changes. Now take away the ground beneath you, so that you are floating, suspended, with no up and no down except the faintest gradient you can barely sense. Now take away the certainty that another living thing is anywhere near you. And now hold that floating, blind, silent, weightless solitude, not for a minute, not for an hour, but for your entire life. That is the world that deep-sea creatures actually live in. And the thing we cannot quite grasp, from up here in our world of light and sound and solid ground, is that they do not experience it as deprivation. They are not suffering through an absence. They have built entire ways of perceiving the world that have nothing to do with the senses we lean on. They are not blind in the dark. They are exquisitely awake to a reality we cannot even perceive. Consider what it means to navigate a world without light. The creatures of the deep cannot, for the most part, see their surroundings the way we see a room. So they feel them. The water itself becomes their medium of perception. Many deep-sea fish have lateral lines, rows of sensitive organs running along their bodies that detect the faintest movements in the water, the tiny pressure waves left by a swimming creature, the soft disturbance of something passing nearby. They do not see a fish approaching. They feel the shape of its movement pressed into the water, read the size and the speed and the direction of it through their skin, in total darkness, with a precision we can barely imagine. They live inside a sense we simply do not have, and the squid, the octopuses, the cuttlefish of the deep, the cephalopods, perceive the world in ways stranger still. Their skin can sense light directly, in some species, so that they feel brightness across their whole bodies, not only through their eyes. Their arms half think for themselves, tasting and touching the world independently, each limb a partial mind of its own. To be a deep-sea octopus is to experience reality in a way so foreign to human consciousness that we have almost no words for it. A distributed awareness, spread across 8 reaching, tasting, half-autonomous arms, in a body that can change its color and texture in an instant, in a darkness it perceives through its skin. We tend to measure other creatures against ourselves. We ask whether they are intelligent in the way we are intelligent, whether they see what we see, feel what we feel. And the deep quietly destroys that whole frame of reference, because down here are minds, and they are minds. The cephalopods especially are unmistakably minds, capable of learning and problem-solving, and what looks unsettlingly like curiosity. That arose on a completely separate branch of life from us, that perceive the world through senses we lack, in an environment we cannot survive, running on a kind of awareness that has almost nothing in common with our own. If you want to know what an alien intelligence might be like, you do not need to look to the stars. There is one in the deep ocean, looking back at the cameras with eyes that evolved entirely apart from ours. In a darkness it understands far better than we ever will. And then, there is the matter of sound. We think of the deep as silent, and in the sense of human noise it is. There is no wind down there, no rain, no traffic, no voices. But the deep ocean is, in its own register, full of sound, because sound travels through water far better than light does, far better than it travels through air, carrying for enormous distances through the dark. The great whales know this. It is why their songs are what they are, those long, low, mournful, structured calls that can travel across entire ocean basins, that allow a whale on one side of an ocean to be heard, perhaps, by a whale on the other. In a world where you cannot see across a single meter, sound becomes the way the deep is spanned, the way the vast dark is crossed, the way one enormous lonely creature reaches out across hundreds of kilometers of black water toward another. And here is something that should sit heavily with you. We have filled that world of sound with our own noise, the deep ocean, which for almost all of its history carried only the voices of its own creatures, now carries the relentless drone of our ships, the hammering of our drilling, the violent pulses of the air guns we fire into the seabed to search for oil, sounds so loud they travel for thousands of kilometers, sounds that may be drowning out the voices of the very whales whose songs once had the whole ocean to themselves. We have not only reached into the deep with our chemistry and our carbon, we have reached into it with our noise. And somewhere out there, a whale may be calling across the dark, the way its ancestors called for millions of years, into an ocean that no longer falls silent enough for the answer to come back. I find I cannot stop thinking about that particular loneliness. There is a single whale, a real one, recorded for decades, that calls at a frequency no other whale seems to use. A voice slightly out of tune with every other member of its kind, wandering the ocean alone, calling and calling at a pitch that, as far as we can tell, no other whale answers. We do not know if it is truly alone, or simply different. We do not even know exactly what it is, but the idea of it has haunted people for years. A single voice in the enormous dark, singing in a key that no one else seems to share, crossing the empty ocean year after year, calling into a silence that does not call back. And maybe that is the truest emblem of the deep there is. Not the monsters, not the glowing fields of tube worms, not the crushing trenches, but a single voice in the dark, reaching out across an unimaginable emptiness, hoping that something, somewhere, is listening, which is, when you strip everything else away, exactly what every creature in the deep is doing, in its own way. The anglerfish following the faint scent through the black, the whale fall larva drifting through kilometers of nothing in search of another death, the deep coral standing alone for 4,000 years. All of them, in the end, are voices in the dark, reaching out across the emptiness, sustained by the slimmest possible hope of connection in a place that offers almost none. And it is, I think, the same thing we are doing. We lower our cameras and our submarines and our hydrophones into the dark, and we are reaching out too, across the same enormous emptiness, hoping to make contact, hoping to understand, hoping that the dark will answer. We are a voice in the deep as much as any creature down there. We are just a very new one, and a very loud one, and we have only just begun to listen for what was already speaking. Which raises the question I have been circling this entire time, the question underneath the question. Why does the deep frighten us so much? Why, of all the places on Earth, does the bottom of the ocean reach into something so primal in the human mind? It is not just the danger. We face danger in many places without this particular dread. It is something older. I think it is this. The deep is the one place left on Earth that does not need us, does not notice us, and was never made for us. We evolved in the light. Our entire being, our eyes, our warmth, our breath, our days and nights, our deepest instincts, is built for the bright, dry, sunlit surface. And the deep is the negation of all of it. It is dark where we need light, crushing where we need air, cold where we need warmth, vast and empty where we crave the comfort of others. To go into the deep is to go into a world that was complete before we existed and will be complete after we are gone. A world that does not soften itself for us, that does not light up at our arrival, that simply continues, indifferent, in the dark, exactly as it always has. We are not the main characters down there. We are not the main characters anywhere. But the deep is the place that refuses to pretend otherwise. And some part of us knows it. Some part of us, looking down into that black water from the deck of a ship, feels the truth that the calm silver surface was hiding. That beneath the thin-lit world we know, there is a vastly larger world that has never known us. That most of our planet is dark and cold and ancient and alive and entirely unconcerned with whether we understand it or not. So let us go down one last time. Let us leave the systems and the stakes and the philosophy behind and simply descend, once more, all the way to the bottom, to the very deepest point there is, and stand there, in the dark, at the floor of the world, and see what it is actually like to be in the place we have spent this whole journey traveling toward. Because the deepest part of the ocean is a real place. It has a name. It has a floor you could, in principle, stand on. And almost no one in the history of our species has ever been there. Let me take you to the bottom. It is called the Challenger Deep, and it lies at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, in the western Pacific, far out beyond any coastline, beneath a stretch of open ocean that looks, from a ship, like any other stretch of open ocean. There is no marker on the surface, no sign. Nothing to tell you that beneath you, almost 11 kilometers straight down, is the lowest point on the solid surface of the Earth. 11 kilometers. Let that number find its scale in you. If you took the tallest mountain on Earth and dropped it into the Challenger Deep, its summit would still be more than 2 kilometers underwater. The deepest point of the ocean is deeper than the highest mountain is tall, with room to spare. It is so deep that a journey to the bottom and back takes the better part of a day. Hours of descent, a brief time on the floor, hours of slow ascent. And in all that descending, you pass through every world we have traveled together. In sequence, one after another, down and down and down. Let me take you down, slowly, the way it actually happens. You begin in the light. The surface world, the silver and the blue, the warmth, the familiar. The hatch is sealed above you. And you start to sink. The first 100 meters go quickly, and the color drains as you fall. The red is the first to go, then the orange, then the yellow, until the world outside the window is a deepening blue. By 200 meters you have left the lit world behind, crossed the line where the sunlight can no longer feed anything, and entered the twilight, the long blue dusk, where the hatchetfish hangs invisible behind its own glow, where the great migration rises and falls with the turning of the day. You keep sinking. By 1,000 meters, the last blue thread is gone. You are in the eternal midnight now, in the largest living space on the planet, and outside your window, the darkness is total except for the occasional drifting spark. A flash, a pulse, a thread of living light igniting and fading in the black as some creature signals or hunts or simply passes by. The dragonfish is out there in its invisible red light. The anglerfish hangs somewhere in the dark with its lantern lit. You cannot see them. You can only fall, slowly, through their world, a small point of borrowed light descending through a darkness that goes on for kilometers in every direction. By 4,000 meters you have passed the floor of the ordinary ocean, the abyssal plain, where the dead of the upper world fall as endless snow, where the bones of whales build cities of life that last for 50 years. But you do not stop there. The Challenger Deep is far below the abyssal plain. You keep going. Down into the trench. Down past 6,000 meters, into the Hadal Zone, the realm named for the underworld, where the trenches hold their isolated, marooned, found nowhere else inhabitants. Down past the depth where the last fish can survive, past that invisible line written in the chemistry of a single molecule, below which no vertebrate has ever lived. Down into a darkness even the snailfish cannot follow. And still you fall, 7,000 meters. 8, 9, 10. The pressure outside is now a force almost beyond comprehension, over 1,000 atmospheres, a weight that would implode an ordinary submarine in an instant, that presses on the walls of your vessel with a force that does not bear thinking about. The temperature has dropped to barely above freezing. There is no light, has been no light for hours, will be no light for the entire rest of your time down here. You are descending into the deepest point in the world, and the world is doing everything in its power to remind you that you do not belong. And then, after a fall of hours, the bottom comes up gently out of the dark. It is not what you might imagine. The deepest place on Earth is not a jagged pit, not a chasm of nightmare rock. It is, mostly, soft. A pale, fine, almost luminous ooze stretches out in the lights of the submersible, a smooth, gentle floor of sediment, undisturbed, untouched, accumulating one impossibly slow particle at a time, across spans of time we cannot feel. You settle onto it, and it rises around you in a soft, slow cloud, the finest dust in the world, dust that has been falling here, gently, since long before there were eyes to see it fall. And you look out the window, at the bottom of the world, and here is what is there. Life. Even here. Even at the very bottom. The amphipods come, the pale scavengers, drawn out of the dark by the lights or the bait, swarming in the bottom of the deepest trench on Earth, exactly as they have for longer than our species has existed. Strange transparent creatures drift past. Tracks wind across the sediment, the trails of things that crawled here, that live here, in the lowest, coldest, most crushing place there is. The bottom of the world is not empty. It was never empty. We came all this way, to the deepest point we could reach, fully expecting the final answer to be nothing, and the answer, here as everywhere, is that something was already living in the dark, long before we arrived to be astonished by it. And then there is the silt, the fine pale ooze you are resting in, because not long ago, when we sent our most careful instruments down to this exact place, to the very bottom of the Mariana Trench, the deepest, most remote point on the entire surface of our planet, we found, lying in that ancient, untouched sediment, a piece of plastic, a bag, a scrap of the surface world, drifted down through 11 kilometers of dark water, come to rest at the bottom of everything. We reached the deepest place on Earth, and our garbage was already there, waiting for us. The single most isolated point on the surface of our world, a place that fewer than a handful of humans have ever visited. A place so remote and so hostile that we have spent more time on the moon than at its floor, and it is no longer pristine. It never will be again. The whole long way down, through every world we traveled, the deep was telling us the same thing in different ways. You are not separate from this. You think you live up there, in the light, far from all of this dark, but your reach has already arrived everywhere your body never will. And so we stand at the bottom of the world, in the deepest dark there is, having traveled as far down as it is possible to go, and we find that the question we started with has come all the way around to face us. What lives in the deepest parts of the ocean? Strange and patient and ancient life. Yes, creatures beyond our imagining, yes. Worlds we have barely glimpsed, yes. But also, threaded through all of it now, faintly, permanently, us. Our chemistry, our carbon, our noise, our plastic. Lying in the silt at the bottom of everything, we went looking for what lives in the deep, and we found, waiting for us at the very bottom, the unavoidable evidence that we are part of it now too, that there is no longer any such thing as a world untouched by us, not even the deepest, darkest, most distant place that exists. But the deep does not mourn. That is the thing to understand, as we begin now to rise. The deep does not grieve our arrival, and it will not celebrate our leaving. The amphipods will go on swarming, the snailfish will go on drifting through their soft surrender to the pressure. The tube worms will go on blooming in the dark around the planet's hot breath. The Greenland sharks will go on living their slow centuries in the cold. The deep corals will go on standing in the black, adding their imperceptible fractions, century after century, as they have since before our oldest story was told. The whales will go on calling across the dark. And the marine snow will go on falling, gently, endlessly, the dust of the dying world above drifting down through kilometers of black water toward a floor it will take 100 years to reach. It was all happening before we came. It is happening now, in the dark, as you listen to this, and it will go on happening, in the same darkness, long after the last of our machines has gone quiet, and the last of our lights has gone out, and the deep has folded its silence back over the brief, loud moment when a curious species from the surface came down to look. So let us rise now. Slowly. Let us leave the bottom of the world. But before we surface, before we leave the dark behind and rise back into the light and the warmth and the comfortable certainties of the world we know, I want to stay down here a little longer. Because there are things in the deep we have not explained, not strange creatures we have cataloged and understood, things we genuinely do not understand. Loose threads. Open questions. Sounds and shapes and absences that we have recorded and turned over and argued about and still cannot account for. And I think you should know them, because they are the truest measure of how little we have actually learned. Let us go back to the sounds. I told you, at the very beginning of all this, that the scientists have heard things in the deep. That is not metaphor. We have been listening to the ocean for decades now, with networks of underwater microphones, instruments originally built to track submarines, to listen for the enemy in the deep during the long tensions of the last century. And over those decades, those instruments have picked up sounds rising out of the dark that no one has been able to fully explain. Some of them we have since accounted for. The enormous sound I described at the start, the one detected across thousands of kilometers, the one that looked almost like a call, was eventually traced, most scientists believe, to the cracking of vast ice, to the slow violence of icebergs breaking and grinding far away in the Southern Ocean. A natural sound, an enormous one, but not alive. We solved that one. We can tell ourselves that one is solved. But there are others. Strange, repeating, structured sounds, recorded down in the dark, that have been argued over for years. Sounds that rise and fall in patterns. Sounds that come from deep places, from remote places, that do not match anything we have cataloged, that seem to carry an order we cannot quite attribute to ice or current or any known machine or any known creature. Most of them, the careful scientists believe, will eventually turn out to have ordinary explanations: geology, ice, the movement of water, the calls of creatures we simply have not connected to the sound yet. Most of them. Probably. But here is the honest, uncomfortable truth. The one the scientists themselves will admit if you press them. We do not know what makes all of the sounds in the deep. We have explanations for some, we have good guesses for others, and for a few, we have nothing, only the recording, only the pattern, only the sound itself, rising out of a darkness so vast and so unexplored that we cannot rule out, completely, that something we have never met is making it. We almost certainly know the largest animals in the ocean. Almost certainly. But the deep has surprised us before. It surprised us with the giant squid we could not photograph for a century. It surprised us with the tube worms living without the sun. It surprised us with life at the very bottom, every single time we were sure there would be none. The deep has a long, consistent history of holding things we were certain could not be there. So when an unexplained sound rises out of the dark, the truly scientific response is not "there is a monster down there." But it is also not "we know everything that could possibly be making this." The truly scientific response, the humble one, the honest one, is "we do not yet know, and the place this is coming from is so large and so unexplored that we cannot be certain what is in it." And there is something far more unsettling about that honest answer than there would be in any monster. Because a monster would be a thing we had at least imagined. The honest answer is that there may be things down there we have not even thought to imagine. Categories of life, of sound, of phenomenon that we do not yet have the concepts for. The deep is large enough to hide not just creatures, but whole kinds of surprise. And it is not only the sounds. Consider what we still cannot account for in the creatures we have met. We do not fully understand why so many deep-sea animals grow so large, the abyssal gigantism we glimpsed in the trenches, the giant squid, the colossal isopods, the siphonophores longer than whales. We have theories, we do not have certainty. We do not fully understand how the deepest creatures find each other across such vast emptiness, how a larva the size of dust reliably crosses kilometers of dark to find another fallen whale, generation after generation, when the odds against any single one of them should be overwhelming. We do not fully understand how some deep creatures live as long as they do. We do not understand the migrations completely, or the navigation, or the chemistry of some of the strangest adaptations. We have the broad shape of it. We are missing almost all of the detail. And we do not understand, even now, how much of the deep we have not seen. Think carefully about how we actually explore it. We send down submersibles and cameras and instruments, and they illuminate a small bubble of darkness, a few meters, a few dozen meters, a single point of light dragged slowly across an immensity. The deep ocean is the largest habitat on the planet, and we have directly observed an almost vanishingly small fraction of it. Most of the seafloor has been mapped only by sound, in low resolution, the way you might map a dark room by listening to echoes, enough to know roughly where the walls are, nowhere near enough to see what is standing in the corners. We have higher resolution maps of the surface of Mars, of the Moon, of Venus, than we have of the floor of our own ocean. The deep is not a place we have explored and now understand. It is a place we have peeked into, here and there, with tiny lights, and otherwise left almost entirely in the dark. So every estimate we make about the deep comes wrapped in that uncertainty. When scientists estimate how many species live in the deep ocean, the honest range spans into the millions of species still undescribed, millions of kinds of living thing, down there right now, that have never been named, never been seen, never been suspected. When they estimate the total mass of life in the deep, the numbers keep rising as we learn more, and there is now serious evidence that an enormous quantity of life, perhaps a significant fraction of all the living matter on the planet, exists not in the water at all, but beneath the seafloor, in the rock and sediment below the bottom of the deep ocean, microbes living in the spaces between grains of stone, kilometers down into the crust of the earth, in a deep, dark, slow biosphere we have only recently understood to be there at all. Think about that. As we hang here in the dark before our ascent, beneath the deepest floor we have traveled to, beneath the ooze of the Challenger Deep itself, there may be more life living in the solid rock of the planet, in total darkness, eating the chemistry of the earth, dividing perhaps once in 10,000 years, living spans of time that make even the deep corals seem frantic. A biosphere inside the planet. Life that has no concept of water, let alone air, let alone light. Life so slow, so deep, so utterly removed from anything we recognize, that we are not entirely sure how to think about whether it is even doing the same thing we mean when we say a thing is alive. We keep arriving at this edge. The edge where the deep stops answering our questions and starts dissolving them. What lives in the deepest parts of the ocean? The honest answer, the one this whole long descent has been carrying us toward, is that we do not fully know, that we have met a strange and wondrous fraction of it, and that beneath and beyond what we have met lies a vastness of life and mystery so much larger than our knowledge that our knowledge is barely a candle in it. We have not explored the deep. We have stood at its edge, holding a small light, and named the few things that swam into the glow. And maybe that is exactly as it should be. Maybe there should be a place left on this earth that does not give itself up to us. Maybe, after we have mapped and named and claimed and changed almost everything else, after we have stood on the moon and reached past the planets and photographed the boulders on Mars, there is something almost sacred in the fact that the largest part of our own world remains dark to us. That most of life on Earth lives in a darkness we cannot enter, by rules we did not write, indifferent to our understanding, getting along entirely without us. We have spent this whole journey asking what is down there. But perhaps the deeper question, the one underneath, was never really about the creatures at all. Perhaps it was about us, about what it means to be a small, brief, sunlit species that woke up on the thin-lit skin of a vast dark world and realized, slowly, with a mix of wonder and unease it has never quite resolved, that the world we call home is the exception, and the dark is the rule, and we are very, very far from understanding the place we live. Now, it is time to rise. The light is calling us back up. But take one last look, before we go, at the dark we are leaving, because most of it you will never see again, and most of it no human ever will. The ascent is slow. It cannot be otherwise. To rise too fast from the deep is its own kind of death, and so the submersible lifts away from the bottom of the world gently, almost reluctantly, leaving the soft pale floor and its swarming amphipods behind, leaving the silt to settle back into the stillness it has held for so long, leaving the deepest place there is to return to the dark and the silence it will keep long after the lights have gone. And as you rise, the worlds come back in reverse. The hadal dark gives way to the abyssal dark, which gives way to the midnight, and somewhere far above, eventually, the first faint suggestion of blue will return, the dim ghost of a sun you cannot yet see. But that is hours away. For now there is only the slow lifting through the black, the pressure easing fraction by fraction, the cold relenting by degrees, and outside the window the same endless darkness, broken only here and there by the drifting sparks of living light. And in that long, slow rising through the dark, you have time to think. To let the whole descent settle in you. everything you have seen, everything that is still down there, below you now, continuing without you. The dragonfish hunting in its secret red, the anglerfish and its fused, dissolved companions hanging somewhere in the black, the whale fall, somewhere out on the abyssal plain, feeding its slow city of the dead, the tube worms swaying in the hot breath of the planet, living without the sun, holding their ancient secret about where life may have begun. The deep corals, standing in the dark, adding their imperceptible fractions, as they have for 4,000 years and will for thousands more. The single whale, somewhere in the vastness, calling in a key no one answers. All of it down there. All of it continuing. All of it indifferent to whether you rise or fall, live or die, understand or never understand. The deep does not need your witness. It was complete before you came down to look. It will be complete after you are gone. We come up from the deep changed, the few of us who go. Not because of what we saw, exactly, though what we saw is beyond describing. We come up changed because of what the deep quietly does to your sense of your own importance. Up here, in the bright world, it is easy to believe that we are the center of things, that the world is the stage we walk across, that life means the warm and the sunlit and the visible, that the story of the planet is the story of us. And then you go down into the dark, into the largest part of your own world, and you find an immensity of life and time and mystery that has nothing to do with you at all. That never did. That simply is. And the belief that you are the center quietly dissolves, and something humbler and stranger, and, I think, more true settles in its place. You begin to understand that the world you live on is mostly dark, that the warm-lit surface is a thin and recent and beautiful exception, a fragile rind around a vast, cold, patient interior. That most of the living things that have ever existed and ever will exist do so without sun, without warmth, without the slightest awareness of the bright, busy world above. You begin to understand that we are not the planet's main story. We are a brief and luminous footnote, written near the surface, in the light, while the long, dark text of the deep goes on and on beneath us, in a language we have only just begun to learn to read. And so you rise. The pressure eases. The cold lifts, and after hours, far above you, the dark begins, at last, to thin, the faintest hint of deep blue bleeding into the black, the first whisper of a returning sun. The twilight zone comes back, the dim blue dusk, the migrating creatures somewhere near, and then the blue grows, and brightens, and somewhere around 200 meters the world remembers color, the warm end of the spectrum returning in reverse, yellow, then orange, then, at last, red, until the surface is a shimmering ceiling of light overhead, and you break through it into the air and the sun and the wind and the enormous bright ordinary world, blinking, changed, carrying the dark up with you in your memory. But the deep does not come up with you. The deep stays. It always stays. And this is the thing I want to leave you with, here at the end, as the light returns and the journey closes. Not fear, not warning. Just this quiet, enormous fact to carry with you the next time you stand at the edge of the sea. Right now, as you listen to this, all of it is happening. Every creature we met, and every creature we did not, is alive in the dark at this very moment. The marine snow is falling, gently, endlessly, through kilometers of black water. The tube worms are blooming around the vents. The amphipods are swarming at the bottom of the deepest trench. The Greenland shark is moving slowly through the cold, in the middle of a life that may span 5 centuries. The deep corals are standing where they have stood since before the pyramids, and somewhere in the vastness, a whale is calling out across the dark, into water that carries its voice for 1,000 kilometers, hoping for an answer. It is happening now. It is always happening. It does not stop when we look away. It does not begin when we arrive. It is the oldest, largest, most patient story on the planet, and it is unfolding, this very second, in a darkness that begins just a few kilometers beneath the calm and ordinary surface of the sea. A darkness you could reach in principle from almost anywhere on Earth by simply going straight down into the part of your own world you will almost certainly never see. We will keep sending our small lights down into it. We will keep learning, slowly, a fraction at a time, what lives in the deepest parts of the ocean. We will name more of it. We will understand a little more of it. And the deep will keep most of itself, as it always has, in the dark, beyond our reach, beyond our knowing, vast and cold and ancient and alive, and entirely its own. The sun sets on the water. The surface goes silver, then gray, then dark. And beneath it, where it has always been, where it will always be, the deep continues, patient, lightless, immense, keeping its creatures and its silence and its long, slow, secret time. And somewhere far below, in the dark that never ends, the ocean goes on without us.